We can start.
Welcome everyone to the second day of the symposium COVID Glossary. My name is Rupali Gupte and I work at the School of Environment and Architecture. At the beginning of last year in February, C held a big conference rethinking the coordinates through which to speak of architecture. We called the conference Songs of Turbulence, where we spoke of reconceptualizing the environment, speculations on emerging urban society, articulations on the questions of difference, thinking through material ecologies, and responding to emerging cultural contexts. Songs of Turbulence seemed like a premonition, as a month later, we went into lockdown. The closest registers that humanity had to reckon with the state were calamities like floods, earthquakes, etc. In all of these cases, though there were devastating consequences, life more or less came back to normal after that. After the first lockdown too, everybody anticipated life going back to normal. But as we soon realized, this was not to be. Things were changing around us and we didn't know how to make sense of it. Things were too close to us to have a critical distance to do so. Here we recalled Salman Rushdie's mobilization in his novel, Midnight's Children, of the contemporary being akin to a cinema where you are watching a movie with your nose to the screen. All you see is pixels. We wondered what it would be like for 200 people then to see each pixel and narrate the story of that pixel in order to piece a larger narrative. That is when we decided as a school that 200 of us will bring together our experiences of the pandemic, compiled together as a glossary on a website. In this glossary, there are more than 400 entries, and these are constantly growing. We hope to bring more insights into it till the end of the pandemic. These insights, we hope, could be put together as patterns to speculate on the trajectories we need to be drawing. To understand what the new normal would be, we hope to also think collectively with our respondents and others about these trajectories. So the past pandemics, the plague, the Spanish flu and others changed the way we live. They ordained new infrastructures of health and sanitation, which in many ways completely restructured our lives. Building bylaws were changed to shape the built form and consequently our lives. Buildings Just give me a second. So the past pandemics, the plague, the Spanish flu and others changed the way we live. They ordained new infrastructures of health and sanitation, which in many ways completely restructured our lives. Building bylaws were changed to shape the built form and consequently our lives. Buildings mandated setbacks as opposed to lining streets. Zoning laws took over. They produced a different kind of sociality and sense of public. Roads, which were produced for a vehicular living, were legitimized by sanitation requirements. It produced a modernity obsessed with health and an altered imagination of the public. Today, 100 years later, we are at the cusp of another shift in social imaginaries as the apparatuses that have structured our lives in the last 100 years are now in disarray. The home, modern institutions, modern infrastructures, and with this, our bodily rhythms, mental states, our societal structures that brought us together or kept us apart have all been jolted out of their proclivities. While the previous pandemics consolidated and settled hard infrastructures like roads and sanitation as necessary dimensions of the city, this pandemic is pushing for the digital to be a necessary infrastructure. The question here is, how is the new normal going to be shaped? From these 400 entries in the exhibition, we have attempted to put together some patterns and trajectories. The patterns, however, are such that though some of them form meta-narratives through certain constellations of experiences, other constellations come together to dismantle these meta-narratives. In the exhibition, we hope to think together with you, with the respondents and the others, of what these constellations would be. With this, I would like to thank some people who have been responsible for this project. I would first acknowledge the 200 participants of the glossary and the exhibition entries, 200 students, faculty and staff at sea, who brought together their most intimate and insightful observations to the glossary. For many, these experiences are deeply visceral. Along with these contributors, I would also like to thank the two amazing designers, Vastavikta Bhagat and Mumal Shekhawat, who gave the glossary the form and the exhibition its present state. Vastavikta has been with the project since its inception and has been central to its conception and formation. Mumal had joined us in the last 3 months, but gave the project a new energy. The exhibition is such that different people will encounter different things. No two people will be able to experience the exhibition in the same way. And in many ways, this form contributes to the complexities of the situation, where narratives and counter narratives shape the experience of the pandemic. Further, I would like to thank our collaborators and partners and supporters, Madhushri Datta, Clara Knapp, Adrian Ramabaya from the Academy of Arts of the World from Cologne. Madhushri is currently the director of the institute and has initiated the project Times of Hands, which is the main provocation for this project. This is also in partnership with two other institutes. I'm just going to say their names in a bit because I missed the PDF that I'd saved before has gone somewhere else. So I'll come back with the names of the two institutes which are our partners. These are long names, so I have to remember them. But we also have our partners from the Goethe Institute, Max Miller Bhavan in Mumbai, Bjorn Kettles and Amrita Nemiwant, who are also with us. I thank the Goethe Institute for supporting this project. So the format for this evening is Vastavikta and Mumal Shekhawat from C, the designers, taking us through the exhibition. They'll walk us both through the glossary as well as the exhibition. So just to introduce Vastavikta, Vastavikta is an architect and a researcher at C and has been involved in a project at C on post-intensive landscapes. She's also an artist, and her modes of drawing are in some ways forms of witnessing, trying to open up nuanced readings of the environment. Mumal is a designer who studied at Shrishti School of Art and Design and has specialized in textile design. Mumal has a multidisciplinary engagement with questions of design and its intersections with society. I would like to invite Vastavikta and Mumal to walk us through the glossary and the exhibition. Mumal, Vastav.
Yeah, can you hear me fine?
Yes, we can.
I'll just stop my video for the part where I'm sharing my screen and I'll come back.
Yeah.
So yeah, Rupali has pretty much given a really good overview of how the glossary has been accumulated and how it stands currently. I'll just go through some of the entries to start us off and the discussion. So the first one is called Office Party. One of my friends is an engineer who graduated this year, is working in a company called Think Analytics. He got a job through a college placement which was conducted online during the pandemic, and he started and completed his training period through work from home. So as a party to celebrate the completion of their training period, the company offered to reimburse for any order that they place on Zomato up to rupees 700. The employee was required to send a screenshot of the order to redeem the amount. My friend ordered multiple boxes of ice cream from Naturals, the sealed plastic container worth rupees 650, since he and his family found this form of food and packaging as the safest option to consume. Next one is of multiple virtualities and realities of space and time. The virtual space has opened up a variety of courses to a variety of people, starting from your mother attending your college lectures to an architecture student attending law webinars. The sense of space-time has changed earlier when it was being at two different spaces at at the same time was difficult. Now it is possible to jump from house cleaning to lectures to webinars to concerts to virtual games in short spans of time, and all in the same space, or with overlaps. Although the attention span seems to have decreased, where I'm able to experience multiple realities at the same time, how attentive am I really, and what goes unnoticed? When once the presence of another body made me behave in a certain way, and now it's just our faces that tend to respond. Only the part of the body that the camera captures is the one interacting. Like if the camera only shows my face, then it's possible that me eating, talking are assumed as the only things I do, hiding other activities that are off my frame. While the rest stays absolutely disoriented or maybe numb. When once the gaze of another body meant something, now I don't know if someone's really looking at me or not when in a group. My father started online photography lectures. The subjects were also modulated to what can be done from a house and what the minimum available equipment. The house was appropriated according to what we worked the space, how we worked the space out. All unnecessary items went inside cabinets, and minimal objects and furnitures that could be easily moved stay in the open. Sometimes the entire room was occupied by the temporary studio, or was divided by three of us making our own space by claiming individual furniture pieces. Although because there are 3 rooms and 3 people living, the overlaps are minimal. The next one is self as field. Yeah, this one. The impossibility/fear of the outside limited fieldwork for academic endeavors. At sea, the idea of self as the field was strategized as a response. In this case, one's body, house, and neighborhood became the field, and one's mind became a repository of memories and experiences from where many notes, observations could be put together. While this limited and scaled down the field in some ways, it also expanded the idea of the field inside oneself. When 40 such fields came together and shared notes in a virtual classroom, the city was reconstructed with these insights. Maybe I can do the spectacled house. Yeah. Can you draw the curtains? Can you please reduce the volume? My head is aching, please. These sentences have been echoed by different voices and have increased in the frequency in the last 3 months. While the nature of work and the learning has primarily shifted to screens of mobile phones and laptops, these instances of migraine seem to have become commonplace. A short visit to the ophthalmologist in a commercial complex in Khar opened up the situation further. The 3-room clinic had now expanded and fragmented. The ophthalmologist in his hazmat suit has now leased another gala on the 2nd floor. He trudges up and down every 30 minutes. The original clinic could not hold the patients along with the social distancing norm. Moreover, the patients have increased and so has the need for space. And the rooms get occupied on shifts, where after each patient is vacated, processes on sanitization and preparing for the next patient are put into place. Advice of less screen time, drops for dry eyes, a common prescription for each individual coming out of the clinic is handed to return after a month. While these are long-term habits and one has to still instill, larger companies provide quick fixes. Blue card lenses with 50% off on frames are sold like hotcakes. Conversations within households emerge to read up on the usefulness of these glasses. While relatives beyond the household choose to discuss this extensively, one brave and adventurous family member decides to try them on. Rather perplexed by the reoccurring migraine and thus the news spreading like wildfire. Most with complaints choose to order, either not sure. The ophthalmologist and the company continue to come up with newer and sometimes questionable schemes. Mother complains of an unusual time. Our ancestors have had such good eyesight. Now look at you kids. The pandemic has really done it this time. Like the last one I'll go through. Time for self-reflection. The starting months after lockdown felt like heaven, where you could just be free, have so much to learn, so many new things to try. It was finally like a dream come true. No schedule, no work, sleep however much you want. You could just be careless. A word that didn't hit until some more months passed by. Gradually, even when nobody told me what to do, the need for a schedule just started eating my head. It just became more and more clear that even though a free way of living may sound like a fancy world to live in, a schedule had subconsciously become an integral part of our daily lives. The need to change the schedules gradually along with different steps of life seem more possible. Suddenly, when everything stops and nobody's certain about anything, it hits that we need to make our own daily certainties. It felt as if I needed a vacation from a vacation. Also, when everything is kind of quieter, the only voice still on is the one inside your head. Thus, the pandemic period made me think and wonder deeply about a lot of things. It was like finally you can come out of the picture and look at it, question it, and understand it. From here, I'll go to the exhibit. Yeah. So the exhibit is constantly morphing, and we are also constantly adding to the glossary itself. And we've tried to draw out some larger boards and constellations of these stories. And the algorithm is as such that the visitor can navigate in multiple ways and no two experiences would be same. So there are multiple of these narrative spheres on the screen. You can zoom in, out, pan, left, right, yeah, top, center, depending on. And once you click on the sphere, it takes you to one of the boards, which you can browse through. I'll stop sharing screen here. Vastu, do you want to share your screen now? So I'll talk about categories. Categories simplify and create boundaries that are defined and policed, and these boundaries can become self-fulfilling. What this does is, it reduces new details and nuance into hardline binaries: private, public, legal, illegal, utilitarian, non-utilitarian, formal, informal, anomalies, and ambiguities. Can we then look for something effective which blurs these boundaries and constructs newer forms of these categories? COVID Glossary is one such attempt at reconfiguring and restructuring these. Not just the past, this archive can also very well hold generative ideas for the future. It has the power to generate meaning as well as challenge existing structures. We are constantly producing meaning through these interpretations and archives of our experiences. The scale is an important idea that reconfigures itself somewhere between street, local, national, and transnational, something like the Zoom call in itself. The scale for all of us has become so much more flexible. We are now talking to the world in different time zones. Boundaries and grids of different offices have become largely mobile. With this greater adaptability in these scalar shifts, we also now have different restraints in different forms. But then again, can this newfound cooperation help us strengthen, not just redraw some of these categories for us? At C-City, a fortnight lecture series, which were a local affair at the school, open to public, has a small budget that invited mostly scholars and practitioners from Mumbai and a few from the country. The event was attended by people from the city, but many were deterred by traffic jams in Mumbai, and the audience had slowly started petering off. Recently, before the pandemic, we had started relaying the event live on Facebook. This saw a few more people, but the audience never exceeded 20 to 25 people from outside school. With this pandemic, we started a new series on South Asian architecture and urbanism, hoping to challenge the narrow parochial nationalistic boundaries. Another lecture to be delivered in Stuttgart, Germany, had to be presented online. The organizers in Germany hired a photographer in Mumbai to make a film and shoot the lecture to be shown at a hall in Stuttgart following social distancing norms. I think here it is also important to mention the scale of the pandemic and how beyond the medical and technocratic jargon lies the story of COVID-19 in the smallest of the nooks and places. The grand spectacle comes down to some very banal forms of living. As a normative scale, we generally see technical analysis of the present and the past, but at what scale do we look at it? Every individual story of grief, loss, and memory feels monumental and heavy. The scale starts from the self, family, to nation states, with each of them holding a different register to talk about the pandemic. The stories come down to statistics in similar ways. One story tracks some of the events for Mr. Parmar. Mr. Parmar, who recently shifted in our society on rent, used to work in Mahindra and Mahindra in the IT department temporarily. He was suffering from tuberculosis. On 15th May, his breathing rates were gradually reducing and he collapsed at home. Doctor advised him to get admitted to the hospital. But in the hospital, there was a different scenario. There was only one bed left, and that too beside a COVID patient. Mr. Parmar refused that bed, but the doctors were not ready to hear him. They forced him. If he will accept this bed, only then we will start the treatment. Otherwise, he can go home. Unwillingly, Mr. Parmar took that bed. After a week, he got discharged and he came back home. 2-3 days later, he started getting fever randomly for a few days. The secretary of the society asked him to do a COVID test where they found that he was COVID positive. Home quarantine was not possible because he used to stay at home alone and there was nobody to take care of him. So he got admitted to the hospital for 18 days and recovered. But in between these health issues, Mr. Parmar lost his job and he shifted back to his hometown. These microgranularities, losses that feel very small in the face of the larger picture, small shifts in routine, multiplied pages of newspaper obituaries, changing hashtags of Twitter, transformed dinner table conversations, are nothing but examples of cutting across these scales. The effect of the pandemic here does not follow clear borders and exits. Today, here we are talking about the entries in our own experiences of what it could mean to inhabit in the future, what speculations we could arrive at from what we are seeing. But it is also interesting to read in between these lines. And from all the entries in the glossary, subconsciously, all of them have a sense of wanting to return back to normal, to be able to go out, meet friends, eat out, think of leisure again, outside, offices, schools, streets, beaches. Even when we are actively trying to rethink our futures, the registers, the languages has been of the past. We're constantly articulating for each one of us what it means to go back, to be able to do the same things as we could do earlier. Here, I'd also like to mention some contributions and prompts around the infrastructures of care and solidarity. Economists refer to both paid care work and infrastructure as a public good. However, traditionally viewed, critical infrastructures focus on roads and bridges, but a broader definition of infrastructure must include care work, which, as we have recently seen, is the basis on which all other work can take place. These systems of workers in childcare, school, hospitals, community centers, and elderly care need a greater investment of thought and policy attention. The pandemic brought some of us to our homes and some of us to the front lines. And in these extreme times of uncertainty, the identity of the care worker was accentuated as an essential worker. So much so that the recent Tamil Nadu elections highlighted a poll promise of providing a monthly salary to homemakers. Few of the stories reflect on their own gendered experience of the lockdown last year. The pandemic has changed the working demographic and restructured routines of members of the house. Before COVID and lockdown, we relied on my mom and housemaid to do the majority of the domestic work. Now it is split between us. This change of medium and jobs has created newer routines which construct our new reality. Now that demolishes the existing set structures and gender roles of a house. Sitting at home was just a boring task for my dad, but my mom was very happy, as she got 6 more hands to help her, right from cleaning the house to cooking food. Me, my sister, and dad helped her. Now we understood how it's difficult to manage everything. While in some cases the lockdown eased some of these gender-bound categories, in most of the cases it didn't. The burden of paid and unpaid care work often gets naturalized and rests on a gendered narrative. Women often end up with a higher share of this care economy. According to the Center of Monitoring Indian Economy, India's labor force participation rate to begin with was 50%, but came down to 40.2% between May and August 2020. But within this data, the stark point is the female labor force participation rate, which stood at 9.3% compared to 67.4% for males. Overall, the female labor force participation fell by 20% in 2020. I think this data point highlights a crucial difference in this invisible human infrastructure that has morphed for all of us. How can we rethink more equitable systems where the institutions of care, gender justice, and love are more instrumental in our discussions about future forms of living? Emotionality and radical softness can be tools to mobilize and build relationships. How can we restructure our ideas around intimacy and our capacities for aid solidarity, and trust through these. From here, I'd like to segue into the solidarity and critical aid it has brought in, but not forego the enormity of loss that we have suffered alongside. Not to undermine the voluntarily based interventions on the part of the civil society, but to acknowledge that on some day, at some point, on some part, we all felt inadequate and vulnerable. Not all oxygen SOS messages could receive aid. All the beds available were not enough. And then there are stories where a friend sitting in Bombay helped another in Delhi find an oxygen cylinder in Faridabad. Navigating through networks and primarily trust bridged some of these most incredible gaps. One of the narratives offers a nuanced insight on some of this. COVID affected someone close to me, and that's when it got real. For some context, Z is my childhood best friend. I have known her since we were about 4 and 5 years old, and since she is a year younger than me, I always called her my little sister. We grew up like that over the last 2 decades, and her family is mine and mine hers. We remain inseparable. It was a whirlwind to say the least. Her boyfriend called me and said, I don't know if you have spoken to her, but her daddy is admitted to the hospital. I asked him if it was COVID-19, which back then was still something we fully didn't understand. I don't think we even do now, almost a year from then. But he said they don't know, but maybe. I called her that evening. We spoke on the phone for some 20 minutes, where she told me that her grandmom was currently on the way to the COVID center at Burli, where the doctor said it would be best to keep her just to be safe. They were still waiting for the results, but that her grandmom was doing fine and they were just going to monitor her. Obviously, there being a lockdown imposed and it was a COVID center. None of them could go and check on her. I just remember being really scared since lockdown began. I think we all disassociated a little bit, looking for distractions and ways to not engage with what was happening outside. That it was too much of an upheaval and too uncertain to be able to handle. And the only way to cope was to not think about it. This pandemic started to feel real again when it happened to her family, and pushed it to the forefront when it affected someone so close to me. What if it was COVID? We still tried to tell ourselves it wasn't, and that we would wait and see. We had all read the articles, heard the stories, we knew how bad it was out there. But seeing her so helpless, knowing that there was nothing we could do except make do in the situation, made that a long night. I tried calling her again that night, but she slept. I remember the next morning I was doing an online course, mainly as a way for me to feel productive. But I got a call from her mom and dropped everything. That's when I got the first text from her saying she got a call from their doctor, saying she's crashing and she doesn't know what that means. Worse, hospitals were out of bed or they needed a COVID test result before they could admit her. I called a relative's doctor who just graduated as a doctor and worked at a KEM hospital, who tried her best after scrambling for hospitals for almost 2 hours, trying to find personal contacts, sending SOS messages on other groups, broadcasting it on social media as a last resort, and making calls to acquaintances and friends. She texted me, Dadi passed away. It was so fast, and we all felt so helpless. There was nothing we could do, and we tried our absolute best. It was the next day, and of course, the nightmare didn't end. They had already isolated themselves at home and were maintaining social distancing as much as they could do in their 2-bedroom house kitchen. They still had to get their test results back, and her entire family had gotten tested to be safe. They also had to do the burial without the family being allowed to be present, all in one day. All while dealing with this loss, I remember there being a prayer meet held, that too on Zoom. Amidst all of this, Z and her sister tested positive, along with her dadi, and her parents tested negative, which meant that her parents needed a spare house to stay in since they couldn't stay together. Z's nanny's house was an option for her parents, but those neighbors were suddenly not okay with them staying in the same building, even though they had tested negative. There was a lot of fear of COVID in general, and it just happened that her family was one who got tested and informed everyone that this is what had happened. But the neighbors in the building were not comfortable with them there. Even after leveraging long established relationships, Z and I had conversations at length about how fear drives people. Even people you shared the same space with. But the fact that they were being driven to be completely inconsiderate and apathetic was something we never really expected. I just needed her and her family to catch a break. The next 2 days were spent trying to find accommodation for her parents while the sisters quarantined in their house. We called friends, spoke to our parents' friend, trying to find any viable option to see if there was anyone willing to cut us a personal favor. When that got sorted out, it sunk in that these two had to do everything on their own for the next month, not just household chores, but also take care of themselves. And then there was another unnecessary annoyance. The neighbor who complained to the municipal corporation using some networks, saying that they should not be allowed to home quarantine and they should be taken to the center. They refused and negotiated their way out. They knew they weren't showing severe symptoms and would rather let the beds be there for someone who needed it. And the BMC knew that there was no substance to the complaint. I just remember spending my days being angry for them, angry that they weren't given a chance to even mourn death peacefully, angry that people simply being terrible all around and making life difficult. But there was someone who gave us some hope. There was one neighbor in the building who would drop hot food off outside their door every day, breakfast, lunch, and dinner. The other neighbors chastised this lady for trying to help, saying that she was putting all of them at risk, but they didn't back down. And I'm also glad, even in moments of complete fear, there was someone who cared enough to think beyond themselves and be there for them through the smallest acts of kindness. And with that, I'd hand it over to Vastu.
Are you sharing a screen? Thank you, Mumal. Over the last year, new spatialities have emerged. Largely, it is the digital that has allowed and disallowed for multiple things. While it has tapped one in a frame contained in a 15-inch screen, it has also connected these series of frames all around the world, not getting bogged down by geographical boundaries of timescales. Someone very truly said yesterday that it has created the only new and accessible outside. The digital is the outside right now. While some argue the contention over the fact that there is really no distinction, and over time, in its essence, the screen has managed to come closer and closer to our bodies, and very soon it will be an extension to us. I won't deny it. It already feels like this. Hearing people talk about screen fatigue is another new term from our glossary. While some complain about this oculocentric nature, others find escapes and disappearances by merely switching off a button. The digital could also be a new home, and not having access to it would imply a new form of homelessness to us. One entry from the glossary contemplates on this expanse of the amorphous techno-digital spatiality one encountered in the first wave, and when it managed to collapse spatiality of work, which was separated from home before. An old USB extension cord I purchased about 3 years ago was brought back to life during COVID, since my new laptop has only two USB sockets. The extension, designed to look like a man whose limbs took on an extra USB extensions, was my rescue for multitasking and connecting more than two devices to my laptop. In the picture, this USB human looks particularly distressed, entangled in the wires. At the same time, he or she is sitting within the black space, which almost makes him appear suspended in a starry abyssal hollow space. The power light in red harks a different kind of fatality, in correspondence to the gently bent neck and legs, that gives the overall posture of its body a somber, depressed demeanor. To a large extent, it talks to the grimness of these times of the pandemic. On the other hand, the image suggests the extended limits of electronic and web connectivity that everyone is largely reliant on during these days. WFH has become another acronym for everyone, which stands for work from home. Social media is saturated with webinars and online talks open to public. Several people have jokingly called it a pandemic of webinars. Amidst all of this, the human body is literally suspended in the e-space while physically immobile. Energized to new channels, such extensions are keeping us afloat and mentally alive. allowing a new kind of normalcy. Another instance from the glossary talks about the anxieties that come with this new spatial reconfiguration. While home is cellularized and multivalent, the cell at times confines one with these techno-digital windows of the web in this case. It has locked most of us to our chairs in one position and space in the house. Multiple screens are now used to engage and inhabit new virtual spaces of work, social life, cultural events, leisure, and entertainment parallelly. Some of these parallel inhabitations have been through the phone, television, iPad, and laptop, which are needless to say new windows connecting to the outside of the four walls. Anxieties of losing connectivity and missing out are seen to be increasing multifolds. And what this has also done has created new sensoriums of mediated sight and sound. While one ruminates over a new form of disconnect that happens with connecting with the entire world. It is the disconnect of the warmth, of the pause, of those unspoken conversations which used to take place between two individuals. I struggle to have that awkward silence, to have that space, to pause, to build my thoughts, to have that time and that space to be myself and to open up my thoughts. The digital medium definitely generated new connections and created new bridges, and will eventually create this new pause, new variables of unspoken conversations, and the new awkwardness in the digital connection. The disconnect of the old times still prevails. While it has brought about efficiencies and choices where one can afford to have a dual or multiple presence, and every space the image of the self is reproduced, be it via the screen or through voice, uh, seeing and being seen occurs in this process within the spatiality of the house, morphing it to this new sensorium of mediated sight and sound. A short excerpt from this instance talks about. My father started online photography lectures. The subjects also were modulated to what can be done from our house and with the minimum available equipment. The house is appropriated according to how we worked, the space out. All unnecessary items went inside cabinets, and minimal objects and furniture that could be easily moved stayed in the open. Sometimes the entire room was occupied by the temporary studio, or was divided by the three of us making our own space by claiming individual furniture pieces. Although, because there are three rooms and the three people living, the overlaps are minimal. While the house or the accessible inside also became the space of performance, completely reconfiguring our ideas of cultural spaces. An instance from the glossary calls it as performing for the frame, where DanceWorks Performing Arts Academy is a dance training institute that teaches multiple forms of dance. A group of three dancers from DanceWorks synchronizes themselves using a song and perform through different locations, sometimes even creating illusions of it being in the same place. This urge to reproduce or replace the physicality of the classroom and relationships was also seen in another instance, where an individual who is also a student and as part of an institute opens up. Having lived with my roommates and worked with them late at night in the first year, it was a lonely experience in the beginning to work at home at night while everyone else slept. As the hours passed, the noise from the street and neighborhood buildings died down, and the lights went off one by one, as I could see from my window. I wondered what my building looked like from the outside, with only my study table light giving off this glow in this entirely dark neighborhood. But our class was quick to shake it off, this feeling of being alone. We made a class meet link especially for this purpose to talk to each other while working simultaneously, helping each other out with doubts, asking for opinions from whoever was online, and to just bring out this feeling that someone's working with you. It is not only these new forms of performance and new methods of learning, but it has also allowed for new forms of faith and spatialities that have emerged. One instance talks about this act of praying, where uh, during the pandemic, we also experienced cyclones and locust attacks. The Bible hints at locust attacks being a sign that we would that the world may soon come to an end. WhatsApp forwards with verses from the Bible stating the same started circulating around. My grandmother is convinced that the end is near and kept nudging us to pray so that our souls go to heaven. Since the start of the lockdown, churches have started live streaming services to pray for everyone in need.
Vastu, we've lost your voice.
Am I audible now? Uh,
Yeah, yeah.
okay, I'll just continue. Um, my grandmother is convinced that the end is near and keeps nudging us to pray so that our souls go to heaven. Since the start of the lockdown, churches have started live streaming masses and prayer services on YouTube. A few families from the community have also arranged Zoom meetings to pray together. The television and the altar are on two separate walls in the living room. During her daily prayers, she would face the altar during the initial lockdown days. She tried adjusting her position so she could face both. Now she just prays to the screen. While the nature of work and learning has primarily shifted to screens of mobile phones or laptops, new forms of enterprises have created new infrastructures, transactions, and new specialities. Another emerging form of infrastructure reshaping or replacing spatiality is the OTT platforms run by a few conglomerates. Binge watching, a Gen Z term that has recently become a part of everyday. It existed as a practice since a few years, but its reach was limited due to availability of the internet and the capacity and the cost of devices available to transfer large amounts of data, like pen drives and hard drives. With the introduction of Geo, Netflix just got its dream fulfilled. The series of lockdown that were triggered by the virus forced people to stay indoors with nothing much to do. Gradually, people did shift to art. A few took up old interests and many paid online streaming services. By 2020, there are several platforms, each fighting to get more viewer and establishing them as a bigger player by creating more exclusive content for users. Since, since that social connection is cut now, they've completely surrendered to these apps. This content gets personalized for all by an AI with a specific definition of success, but does not care for morals. The ads, the genre, become more specific and better at targeting someone as days pass, by where I now see more and more people glued to their screen. Be it a family dinner, a movie night, a date, boring afternoon commute, sleepless nights, or even going to the restroom. An instance from the glossary also talks about the institutions of health insurance and claims, where a relative of the health insurance officer says. So basically, these companies collected money, and first wave May, a lot of them gave away a lot. So right now, even they don't have enough to supply for all the claims that they're getting. So even the premiums of these offers have increased a lot. So if you now renew your insurance, there is ideally a jump of at least 5 to 9,000 than what it was before, and that people are not able to deal with this gap also right now. This new techno-digital spatiality is also producing new forms of institution. This, like the collapse of the house and the home, the pandemic also quickened the collapse of modern institutions of healthcare, education, governance, banking, and the insurance companies, as the glossary suggests, or what was felt by a number of us. This collapse was also felt more disproportionately, more in places it barely existed. For example, in the case of the education system, where one was debating on the online exams, evaluation methods, and the objectivity, questions of access and privilege were not left far behind in contexts where the internet and infrastructure might have not even existed. In a way, a nimble institution was connecting with the world and forming new peer learning networks, whilst one of its students was volunteering to teach kids from a distant outgrowth to the city of Mumbai with the aid of donated mobile phones. One such instance narrates when the immediate physical context shrunk, the world came closer. We were now talking to peers from across the world in webinars, online juries, online workshops, biennales, on ideas of space, justice, life, and living. One was not restrained by travel budgets, time schedules, etc. This may open up new ideas of new kinds of peer learning communities and collectives in the future, and new agile forms of institutions that refuse to congeal and limit one's imagination, like most present institutional structures do. And in these new pedagogic tools of semi digital systems and methods, there is this dimension of narrowing of the gaze where one instance narrates. Our elective module that took place during the monsoon semester in 2020 was conducted online. Our subject was object designing. Post our final presentation, we realized that our objects were of a scale that could fit on a table. Every day we would take a corner, sit down on the table, open our laptops, and start working. Our gaze had been fixed on the table for so long that our minds were concentrated in that space that reflected through our objects. And like this, we see new autodidacts emerging and generating collective knowledge, There are new forms of institutions emerging in the face of the systemic collapse, where one instance narrates the story of support systems and friendships bracing us all. A person elaborates, यहाँ पे सुबह मॉर्निंग में एक अवेयरनेस वैन चलता है, वो अनाउंस करते जाता है अगर थोड़ा सिम्टम्स है आपको, अगर हल्का सा सर्दी जुकाम है या माइल्ड फीवर आ रहा है तो आप टेस्ट कराने मत जाओ, होम क्वारंटाइन हो जाओ। उन्होंने ऑक्सीजन मीटर्स भी सर्कुलेट किए हैं घर घर में कि ये रखो और चेक करो, अगर लेवल्स डाउन हो रहे हैं तो टेस्ट करो, बिकॉज द टेस्टिंग लैब्स आर फ्लडेड। And this is how new nimble networks of care and friendship have emerged, where another instance narrates. There are these support systems, which are kind of, which are molding cities and societies. And these systems are under threat and are crumbling, which was the eventuality. But what holds us together is our compassions and our friendships, and kicks and trips, and individual energies. And I think there is a value in that because these small forces, which are basically friendships and compassions and energetic selves, these are the ones which actually hold the society. Any which means they are the ones. The society is not held by these systems. They're really held by small forces. And these small forces are critical in nurturing. And they are accountable to themselves. Like friendship is not a compulsory thing, no? Not like responsibility. Friendship is not like responsibility. Friendship just works with something else. Compassion is not a responsibility. And similarly, trips and kicks, the energetic self, it works with, there is nobody asking you to be compassionate, be friendly, or have a kick off. It is these small forces which actually kind of, keep societies together. And it is not the big systems that hold these things together. The glossary like this recorded many slippages. One realized that there was that while there was no equity while booking vaccines on platforms, people came up with guides and mutual aid to hold each other through this process. A large surge of volunteerism, online therapy, fundraisers were the only images flashing on one's social media screens. Similarly, strange networks were rekindled in the face of the second wave to procure resources, be it Twitter or an old colleague or the number of a pharmacist passed over a family WhatsApp group. Social media platforms started acting as communication channels. Mosques were offering their premises, while gurudwaras had started oxygen lungers. Students formed volunteer networks, journalists who were also doubling as relief workers. It was these nimble autonomous networks, these new forms of rhizomatic structures of friendships, connubialities, hacks, and myths that held some of us together and kept us afloat. I'd now like to hand it over to Rupali.
Thanks, Momal and Vastavika for taking us through the glossary and the exhibition. So I'm going to just, before I move on, I need to also introduce the other partners in this. So the COVID glossary is actually a response by the School of Environment and Architecture to the project Time of Hands that is proposed by the Academy of Arts of the World, where other partners are the Institute of Experimental Performance at Federal University of Rio de Janeiro and Academy of Media Art, Cologne. So that was something I had to mention before I move on. But I would like to, maybe also summarize in some ways the ideas of speculations and projections that we've been thinking through from this assimilation of the glossary. I'll bring up 7 points that we have in some ways formulated, but we hope the respondents and others will be able to help us bring together many more trajectories of thinking of possible speculations for the future. So as we discussed yesterday, before the pandemic, there were already fissures that were visible in the ways that we were organizing our society. The pandemic, in many ways, turned those fissures into gaping holes. We have been trying to understand these shifts and these possible trajectories ever since. So these 7 points that I'm going to make, the first point is that though the pandemic, through the pandemic, we have seen new logistical efficiencies coming up with entire offices, cultural institutes, education systems, and even health systems sometimes going online with the pandemic. This we predict will continue post-pandemic, Offices might no longer exist. Retail spaces may not exist in their present avatars. Schools, colleges might shrink. Cultural institutions might need to rethink their form. Though the current shifts we have taken a toll on bodily rhythms, these may reshape our bodies, inhabitations, lives, sensibilities in the future. The second point I want to make is we have seen new spatio-temporal reconfigurations take place. While the takeover of the digital has limited the physical footprint, transactions have intensified and no longer are governed by geographic and temporal imperatives. These have implications on the nature of organizations, institutions, infrastructures, etc. Third, new ideas of homes may, on the one hand, create cellular living as work mixes up with living, but on the other hand, new forms of collectives beyond the familial unit may start taking shape, as we have seen through solidarity networks in the present pandemic. Fourth, we see new economies emerging. This is going to be the decade of health, of environment, shaping what happens to industry, transactions, ideas of leisure, films, etc., and the consequent ideas of space. Fifth, institutional cracks are more and more apparent with the pandemic. Could post-educational spaces see a rise as the digital creates possibilities for autodidacts to flourish? Could cultural spaces then become these post-educational spaces? Would disciplines blur? Could we generate a public culture around knowledge as opposed to creating ivory towers of expertise fed by institutionalized structures of validation through publishing, peer review networks, etc.? How could the present digital homelessness be addressed? Would rights be extended to the availability of internet access? Sixth, besides hard infrastructures related to health, education, economy, this pandemic has revealed new infrastructures of care, justice, love. Often we take these for granted as they come from feudal systems and from affective gendered labor. But the pandemic also showed us that we as humanity are capable of building an infrastructure of mutuality with strangers. In my own experience in the hospital, I saw, that was when I was down with COVID, I saw COVID patients helping each other, nurses in PPE suits not failing to speak of beauty and care in the most dire circumstances. In other instances, complete strangers coming together to feed strays, contribute to charity networks, go around verifying lists of oxygen supply and medicines. We believe that small forces seem to be holding society together in the pandemic. Would centralized infrastructure then have to morph with such small forces in the future? What would be the form of this morph, we ask? Seventh, and that's my last point, I would like to make is related to new cartographies, ethnographies, processes, and methods. With change of transactions and geographies, changes in ideas of time and space, our older methods of mapping and evaluating based on older cartographies, ethnographies, processes, methods are also in shambles. We need new epistemes of knowledge and new methods of engaging with these. The glossary is one such method that relies on a collective engagement in narratives and counter-narratives. Likewise, could we look at new forms of sensing and sensoriums, new forms of collective storytelling, new logarithmic methods of engaging with soft data that is not binary and holds the complexities of life and living, along with new terms through which to understand the world around us? So that's I'm sort of ending with these 7 sort of not completely formed propositions, and we hope that the respondents and everyone else will help us to think through these. I would like to invite 3 respondents. I'll introduce them one by one. These 3 respondents, some of them have been friends for many years, others are acquaintances, but ones that we have been familiar with and have been following their work for a long time. So the first respondent is Jivesh Bakchi. Jivesh is a dear friend for many years, with whom sustained conversations have constantly fueled our intellectual curiosities. He always brings new ways of seeing things, never allowing easy narratives to settle. He's an artist and curator and part of the Rux Media Collective, who have been important artists, philosophers, and provocators of the contemporary. I also have to mention that Jivesh is a fantastic cook. So the conversations always come with enduring meals. So thank you. And Jivesh, I'd like to invite you for your response.
Thank
Should
you,
I share
Rupali.
my screen now?
No, not now.
Okay.
I'll just make 5 broad comments, and then then I will focus on the glossary. Yesterday, and everybody can hear me, hopefully, because my computer went hot. Yesterday, the whole poetic. So I thought today I will start with some inflection on the poetic. I'd made a link. I posted a link of Milind Wakankar, who is an incredible scholar on Kabir. He makes a very interesting observation about.
Jivesh, you're breaking a little bit.
Hello, it's breaking. Now it's fine.
Jivesh,
It's
Okay.
fine for us,
you,
Rupali.
you are breaking a little bit.
Okay, I'll speak slower, maybe that way.
Fine, Jivesh, go ahead.
Okay. So Milind makes an interesting comment, which is Shabnam Birmani made this long film on Kabir project, and it is in internet. So she goes to a village in fairly far off in Rajasthan, pretty deep in Rajasthan, and there is a man recites. There is a gathering. A man recites. A very old man recites a poem of Kabir, beautifully narrated. She asks him where did he learn, where and how, and that's a kind of antecedent to that recital. And he said, I made it up. I wrote it now. And it was a poem by Kabir. So what Milind says that this idea that Kabir is not a gift of poetry, but gift of poesis, an ability to produce the poetic imagination as all sides. And the amount of poetry that is associated with Kabir from, say, the collection in Vishwabharati with Amartashan's father, which is 4,000, which is from the Baul tradition to Bihar, which is the Sandhya Bhasha to Punjab, to Guru Granth Sahib, to Rajasthan, to Madhya Pradesh. And he says that this is that gift of poesis. And I think while looking at glossary, and I think yesterday, the whole night I was trying to struggle with the idea with what happens to the idea of the poetic. So I was thinking maybe we have to draw into different genealogies of understanding what is this gift that we are actually working with, because this is a form. In the glossary, while reading it, I feel that I am also a kind of a part of a glossary. You know, it's in a strange way, it refuses narrativity towards more a database construction. That's the debate in early 20th century that Lev Manovich poses between the database and the birth of and the narrative cinema. So, and that debate will continue. I think glossary is part of the debate, but I was trying to draw a different genealogy because the poetic emerged as a form. So whether we can think through the gift of poesis or gift of any other kind. And since today, the beautiful recital, with almost a recital by Mamul and Vatika, they almost took it to that poetic level. And I wonder if the glossary could be a good podcast. A certain kind of podcast versioning of the glossary could be built, which allows many voice to enter our consciousness. So this is the first point, which was basically to link to my good friend Solomon's distress of what happens to the poetic. So, and then we move ahead to 4 more points, very short, I won't take much time. There's this idea of the normal, as if there is something visible in the inhabitation called the normal. Normal, we know, it has been always constructed as through the idea of deviance and the pathological. So normal is a construction, but I think even that normal will no longer appear. It's very simple. The last 20 years, epidemic gaps have increased, the intensities have increased, geographical spread has increased. So, and you say there are 7 big, one pandemic 2 pandemics and 3, 4 epidemics have happened over the last 20 years. It is like the hurricanes. The intensity has increased. The gap between 2 hurricanes have increased. And this is and to say that it will go away. No, we know enough of our present agricultural politics. We know enough of our changes in crime. So it is like against all indicators, you have this idea, you will impose an idea of normal. So this normal is against the climatic, This normal is not about pathological or deviance. We are producing, when we return to normal, it's a desire to overcome the climate or overcome our agricultural practices. When I say our, it means I'm saying that I'm not Monsanto, but our means the consent that we give to the tower. So we are talking about inhabitation without normal. And I think that leads me to the third point, which is if you have an inhabitation without normal, we are in a very interesting situation where the disruptive, the divergences are, the detouring is part of that. It is not, you say that there was normal and there was deviance. There was normal and there was detouring. The categories are completely collapsed. So I propose a way. It said we may be in a short century with a very long now. So they may sound an oxymoron, but the feeling of the now may be extremely long, and but the century may be small because the acceleration experience may be much smaller. So you experience an acceleration, and with this in the COVID, because COVID is the paradigmatic structure in which the glossary has been produced. COVID, any experience of COVID and Rupali, and I'm sure all of you and the text that you read so beautifully, COVID produces this idea of an accelerated intensity. April, everything looked very different here. The whole April to mid-May, the whole world looked like not there. The appearance had changed. And then now I hear that whoever has gone through it and whoever has not gone through will be the long shadow COVID. So the idea of the shadow is now a part of a common sense of one's life. So what you have, that's why I'm saying the long shadow, a long now, extending beyond our comprehension of the event space called the now, de-accelerating and accelerating in ways that is beyond our comprehension at some level. So, and we take it as part of the now. So in that sense, it's short century long now. And the connected point to it is that are some of the present situations anticipated before? A friend of mine, a dear friend, also Lawrence and Rupali and Prasad also knows her. She used to say that she was in quarantine because of certain medical procedures for some time because of immunocompromised. And she used to say, because of being the quarantine for a long duration, because being immunocompromised, her immunity system was almost null. She used to say, am I in the city or I have to visit the city? And it's a very fascinating thing. That was a very specific question. You had to be in this quarantine. The question that was boiling, that was asking how to be in the city, because am I in the city or it's disappeared from the city? And this is something that I think has become a general question. That specific experience is no longer specific. It has become a general question. So that is what one could have, what was an anticipated question of a very specific kind coming out of a very specific condition is now a general. And I think we can tease out many such, and this teasing out of many such things takes away the question of scale to a different proposition, and also time. That the sensorium of time, there are many tiny threads that are running through us. Our ability to sense them will change the conception of time. The second thing is the most important part we hear, the digital. Digital has had many lives. Already in 30 years, it had 4 lives, as in my own life, which is pretty not that long though in the group it may look long, but it's not yet that long. So in a sense, that digital had went from boom, crash, boom, social media, personalized media. So if you look at the history of the last 30 years, you will find it has already changed 4 times, and it is going to change rapidly. So what it is now, the digital, that everybody is the screen, the digital, was part of multiple practices. It was part of your practice. It was part of a practice that was at some level secondary. Institution considered it secondary, your parents considered it secondary, cinema considered it secondary, but now it is primary. Or you can say there is no differentiation between the secondary, tertiary, and primary in our reconfiguration of stratification of what is to be valued. So that has changed. The technological order has reconfigured itself along with us. So here it is very important to locate the us, because my comments on the glossary is based on that. This is the third, and so this is the fourth point. And the last point, I would say, what I found striking in the glossary, and what I found striking in many writings that I have seen in last 20 years, some I have seen in very close, in some I have seen from distance, some I have read and admire, is the disappearance of the juridical from the writing. In the sense, when I say juridical, I don't mean the writing law. What I say, the writing in the language of petition. What is very refreshing in the glossary, and I think that is what yesterday's reading was leading to, was it doesn't petition anyone. So there is no big other, third other, that third space, the God, the state, that which will listen, that has a reasonable listening, who can dispense justice. So what it does is that it shifts away our writing, our thinking away from that juridical, which, post-emergency in India did have a tremendous impact the way our language was produced. PIL is one way in which you will see, but the juridical became a very important site of a battle, of a social struggle. Then it consumed other speech. But I think in COVID, with the collapse of the infrastructure, with the collapse of what was considered the space for the juridical, what was considered the space of a critique of the state through the juridical, and the petition as the primary language of speech, or petition as a primary language of talking to each other, has gone. So what you see in the glossary is an incredible new generation coming who do not speak in the language of petition. And I think this will be a very important struggle in pedagogy, because I think a generation that is talking to them has grown up in the language of petition. And I think it will be something that I am also interested in now, in listening, because listening, I understand. Reading, you get a sense, but in listening, you get the sense, because the mood changes. And the mood is not one of making a petition to anyone. And this shift, and in the end, there was in the reading today, and this is the important thing, that something has risen in the last 2 months, has accelerated this idea of what happens to this new space of mutuality. What language will it speak? I think the glossary's value would be to think a kind of a gift of a poesis of mutuality. If it can think itself like that, if it can project conceptually, not through the discourse of urbanism, not through the discourse of a contra, which I was objecting to yesterday, but to a discourse, a new gift of a poesis of mutuality, a kind of a re-invoking other streams of which deals with violence, which deals with grief, which deals with mourning, and and a generation that is so young is able to do that with such ease and such kind of comfort in front of others, clearly showing that there are new poesis in the beginning. And now, Mawal, you can show the, I will make some specific comment on some of the glossary to kind of elaborate some of the reading I did. I'm going only through the visuals because I found them helping me to think more with a degree of alertness. Well, Rupali introduced me as someone who cooks, so cooking is ingredient. But what I found amazing in this is the geometry of this image. The geometry. This is the image after a person has done a lot of washing. So this is an image of labor. It is image of care. It is an image of safeguarding oneself, and it is an image which organizes, which kind of, and the bhindi and the chili, the okra, bhindi is okra, and the chili has a different geometry. The leaves have a different geometry. The I don't know the name, Kaddu, whatever name, has a different geometry. But you see the geometry very carefully. There is a multiple propensity in this geometry. And this is what I really admired in this ease of this photograph. It says washing, I think. I think it just says washing in the caption. And there is this whole photograph of washing and all. But the papaya coming out. So there is a sense of volume, there is a sense of organization, there is a sense of densities. And those densities are not comparable densities. They are very distinct, specific densities. If you go to the next slide, what you have is the image of an apparatus. Now the apparatus produces bodies and structure, we know, but apparatus also produces a certain amplification of few of those propensities. So the kaddu may become the body of the policeman, how they're standing. The rows and columns may be just pure potatoes or whatever. But you see this propensity, this is what is the propensity in this photograph. One thing is the intimacy of the earlier versus the distance in this. And it's the distance and the intimacy. And in this distance, you see a certain observation of a propensity of a certain geometry, which is in that photograph also. But that geometry is part of a multiplicity. Here, it is a propensity that has been consolidated and expressed. I think the debate that we will always have is what are these propensities that are consolidated. In that sense, this propensity is also in us. This is not a propensity sui generis coming from air. It is a propensity by which we, if you go to the earlier image, if you see it in the glossary, you will see there is this propensity. But there are also other forms of other propensity that are odd and that are also playing with this propensity. Go to the next. So I think what we need to understand in this glossary is that there is this tussle between multiple propensity. And the projection, if we start projecting narratively, by taking one order over the other and forgetting that it is actually a tussle and a collision of multiplicity of propensities, perspectival propensities and arrangement propensity, then so that's the narrative future. That's where the voice, the podcast, that the narrative future, that's where the poesis will stand its test. The next. Now you see this, a festive. The festive, the red carpet, the festive has also laying down a propensity. But what is very interesting, and I wanted to lay that photograph and I somehow forgot, and I think, not forgot, I somehow didn't put it. There's this beautiful set of eating and cakes photographs in it. And you will see it is in rows and columns, but they are all very, very clumsy. They're all very, very, they change the rows and columns into excesses, into markings. So this propensity of order is always in a certain kind of discomfort or awkwardness with a certain other propensities. And I think this, in many of the text, in the many of the desires of which the text outlay, there is this tussle, there is this battle. And I think this is I enjoy that tussle. Can we go to the next slide? Okay. Now this is a very beautiful slide which says empty city. And now I go back to my friend's earlier question. Where is the city? Am I in the city? Now this place, is it in the city anymore? So when the word empty city, so this hyphenation of the city, now there is an auto, there is a car, there is a wetness, there are structures, there are streets. Nothing has really altered it. And in a normal everyday occurrence, if you take this photograph, you will not put an empty city. So this question, this visiting the idea of the city with the word empty produces a new resonating figure. Where does the city lie? Partly, I would say, in our imagination, and partly in the crowd, and partly in this emptiness. So I would connect. It is also a question of geometry and its fullness. It is also a question of an excess. What is it that we are searching that we say is empty? Is it us not being there? What is it? And in the next slide, it's a very beautiful, it's a city, hopefully. It's a sky of a city. It's a two people reading, I guess, maybe doing C's homework or classwork or drawing whatever's object. But the poem on the left breaks through idea of space that is in our mind through the idea of sound, to the idea of piercing. So if even the first four lines, with the twilight closing in and the silence stretching out, a dog howls from a distance, another responds. Here, a very crucial, and the poem is very beautiful actually. Whoever has written, congratulations. This sky, and the photograph is also very nice. For me, this top part was more evocative. The light, the sky, the inside light, outside light, the moon, the street light produces a howl, and you can go to a history of the howl in poetry. There's a beautiful poem, but that's different. This howl pierces through multiple, so that white idea of the empty city is also this four line. That four line fills up, and by writing another response, it fills up that emptiness. And when we are talking about this, so there is a perimeter being drawn with the twilight closing in, the silence stretching out. There is a perimeter. The self is not a material construct. The self is not bounded. It is expanding, it's unbounded. It picks up a connectivity with a howl and then grows. Next slide. Now, this is where, I think that growth is internal. It's the left, the sound, the howl. I looked at this as a kind of a multiple sound, another response. This is the another responding, but with a multiplicity of sound picked up from all around. And the mind can go to Saturn, Jupiter, and Moon. It is also from the COVID glossary. So the picking up of the Saturn, by the way, from the telescope, Saturn is just mind-blowing to see Saturn. It is magical. You should all do one Saturn viewing. Then you will never say Shanika Dasha Laga hai. You will never say. It will just, it's such a beautiful object itself in the celestial sky. Jupiter. So this, now the question is, what is the perimeter of the self? Now this earlier question, the empty city, am I in the city? What is the city? The embodiment, the searching of the embodiment as a question is broken down in the glossary. We're continuously opening up the perimeter of the self. The self is an expanding perimeter. It is stratified, but expands. It picks up howls, it picks up responses, and it actually can stare at the Moon, Jupiter, and Saturn. So it's a cell that actually, if it had not reached the sense of quarantine, would not probably have registered it publicly this way, collectively. Not individually, you may have, in the collective sense. And I think that's the possibility we go with. What is this perimeter of the self? This question, in Yokohama Triennale, when we were doing, a lot of artists, we were discussing this question. And where does the perimeter of the self lie today? Personal histories, how far they go, objects, everything, And this is the question with histories of objects. Everybody is asking this question in some form, somewhere. Next slide. And this is it goes here also. The beast, that incredible appearances in your dreams, hallucination. By the way, in COVID, you hallucinate a lot. So I think whoever has drawn it understands hallucination, understand the beauty and the beastliness of it that comes to you. So I'm just kind of outlining that there is a play with the perimeter, as much as with geometry, the collision of geometries. There is a place with perimeter. The perimeters are in kind of a disguise, sometimes playfully opening up, sometimes mutually expressing itself, sometimes just being able to stay with itself as a exploration. Next slide. This is a slide that kind of, I thought, will express what I'm trying to say. It's an empty city on the right, which is which is waiting in its perimeter for the conversation. And at the left, I thought it was stay inside when outsiders are in the house is the most complicated sentence I've ever heard. So I was trying to figure out the meaning and the structure of the sentence. It's not an oxymoron, but it is a sentence of our time. So stay inside when outsiders are in the house. Oh, it's outsiders are outside. I cannot tell outsiders. So even the word outsider and insider has lost its meaning. And this right-hand side, this structure, this round structure, as it in conversation, the peeping way in the photograph has been taken. It's something very evocative of the earlier question, empty city, into outsider, insider as a fictive category by which we produce our imagination of the city. This is an imaginative construction, but it's also this fictive continuous construction that we have to do, which is violent at sometimes, which is extremely latent with all kinds of aggression, but is also latent with all kind of open world to the mutual possibilities. Next slide. Am I good with time? Just two more slides. This is, I think, this is the kitchen as bathroom. It's most the kitchen is drawn as a modern modcom. Is in my building, everybody does one thing. They keep on two things of modernity in India is that the bathrooms are always being modernized and the kitchens are being modernized. If you go to online, these are two big facilities of modernization. The drawing room stays, object changes, but the modernization is of the kitchen is very modcon here. But the bathing in the kitchen completely transforms. So it looks like this body is from somewhere else. This body is from somewhere else. This habit is from somewhere else, is moving and transposing itself and disrupting the production of the seamless architecture. And I think this, from an architectural school, this I thought would be the most disruptive image I've seen of changing our habits and behaviors as something that does not fit with the architectural imagination within which it is located. So I think the disruptiveness of this act, to me, it's not a habit. It is not a lack of space. It is purely a playful disruption of a possibility of looking at space differently. And the next, this I would end because that's below this excess, the desire to, what you would call, consume yourself, the desire to be desiring, the desire to be desiring as a who is in excess, who completely transforms the terms that the so-called domestic or so-called habitation, the narrowing of the habitation is produced. So in that sense, this COVID glossary exceeds the structure of habitation. So in a sense that what it says is that somewhere latent, in a very latent way, through its images, through its words, through its caption, somewhere it is saying that habitation is not fully comprehended and legible. The desires and, has been locked, has been understood, has been processed. No, there is something, some latent force within the self, that some latent desiring, some latent excess that is expressing in a way that we are yet not probably comprehending, will never comprehend. But this is going to be the latent, for me, this is the latent disruption of the coming space of the glossary, or people like us who will think the glossary as a gift to which we have to think through what is the nature of this gift. Thank you, Rupali. Thank you, Mamol.
Thank you. Thanks, Jibesh. This is wonderful. So many ideas to work through, and also kind of see the glossary in a new light, the gift of poesis, and I mean, the whole idea of inhabitation without the normal, right? Is there ever a normal? How do you kind of inhabit without the normal. And the idea of the short century and the long now, I think very beautiful ideas. And I mean, also in some ways, this idea of the perimeter of the self and the expanded perimeter that you've kind of begun speaking about. I think that was also something that started with the Yokohama Biennale, but it's wonderful to see the glossary through this lens of what does it mean to kind of think of the expanded perimeter, and this form of and a kind of disruptive a kind of disruptive poesis of seeing the everyday through, right? Like it's not through the sense, through the kind of lens of the normal or the new normal, and sort of looking at things through binaries, but in some ways seeing the kind of latent potentialities that sort of exist within the pandemic, and how it sort of also opens up many worlds for us, and many kind of epistemes. I think that's a wonderful sort of way of expanding this experience of the pandemic for us. So thanks, Jivesh, and we'll come back to these discussions in the closing remarks. So I'd like to invite Maria Laura Ghidini. Yeah, hi, Maria. So Maria Laura is a curator whose work explores the intersections between art, technology, and society, particularly the way technology morphs behaviors and relationships. She formerly taught at Srishti School of Art and Design, and is now a visiting researcher at the Exhibition Research Lab, ERL, of John Moores University in Liverpool. For us, it was interesting to invite Maria Laura because of her work, which is at the intersections of art and technology, and in some ways forms the central core of her work. Because I think it's important to think of new registers of thinking of the archives of the contemporary through, and like we discussed yesterday also, we need new forms of sort of entering this kind of imagination. So thanks, Maria Laura, for accepting our invitation, and I would invite you for your responses. Thanks.
Well, thank you for having me, and thank you for the introduction. Can you hear me clearly? Okay, so I'm just gonna share my screen, and then I'll start. Is my screen visible? Yeah, okay. Just 1 second. So what would ever become of me without the internet? So I decided to start with this question, which is actually taken from a section of the book Minima Viralia, The Non-Solitary Solitude of an Anthropologist in Quarantine by Massimo Canevacci. So Massimo Canevacci is an anthropologist whose work focuses on ethnography, visual communication, art, and digital culture, including also the idea of polycentrism. And this book, it's a very interesting diary of his daily experiences during the first lockdown in Italy. So I'm starting with this question, since the internet and the screens have been dominating our lives in an unprecedented way since 2020. And although they have been a form of consolation or helpful means of production, like in the instance of the COVID glossary and the very interesting exhibition that I saw, they've also been profoundly morphing our behaviors. Excuse me, I'm trying to move something on my computer. Just 1 second. I would like to read an excerpt from the book that I mentioned before I try to respond to the glossary from the angle of my curatorial practice. So the dramatic experience that we are living because of the virus is encouraging even more the penetration of ubiquitous identity into everyday life. Paradoxically, staying at home, everything that happens outside involves me and sometimes overwhelms me. I connect with Brazil twice a day, read newspapers in 4 different languages, listen to little news, watch TV series, chat with people I adore, or who are friends, and sometimes even stranger. In short, this immobility favors extreme ubiquity. So I'm interested in this idea of ubiquity, as well as that of polycentrism. Oh, excuse me. That is the existence of many center, autonomous center, in the role that these play since the pandemic started. So can you just give me 1 second? Excuse me. Sorry, it's very hot in the room where I am. So I'm currently talking from room 101 in a COVID hotel in the periphery of Milan in Italy. It's my 9th day of mandatory isolation. Sorry. This time feels like the nowhere buffer zone between the India that undergone a dramatic second wave of the pandemic and the Italy that has eased many restrictions and is getting ready for sunnier summer days. Despite the more discomforting remarks that I could make about these 2D scenarios, I wish to concentrate on this idea of isolation, which appears a few times in the glossary. In terms of our spatio-temporal experiences, the pandemic has taught us that we got too accustomed to move from one place to the other with too much ease, and we have been immersing ourselves in different environments just by landing somewhere and hop around. This year, I experienced the pandemic in 2 places, Bangalore in India and Brescia in Italy, twice. I undergone quarantines in both places, experienced lockdowns in both places. I obsessively consumed local information, data, and personal stories in both places. Sometimes the differences were striking, sometimes the similarities brought these 2 experiences together. This was certainly not ubiquity, but it was a time of experiencing differences, sometimes extreme, that also allowed me to see things from a distance, from the perpetration of inequalities to small acts of generosity in community building, from depolarization of opinions and judgments to types of isolation that were distressful and created fears and suspicions. Convivial gestures like clapping hands and pans on balconies perhaps look similar on the surface across these 2 countries, but certainly have had different meaning, especially politically speaking. What the COVID glossary allows its readers and viewers to do, in my opinion, is to take a step back and put themselves in someone else's shoes in a way that it allows for looking at the present we are living in from a different angle, so in a sort of buffer zone. Since I'm responding from the angle of my curatorial practice, I decided to let this presentation to be guided by some of the categories and issues that emerge from the glossary. An interesting combination of tags that I found was nomads, along with work and dwelling. A large part of my work since its inception has been tied to the internet and the possibility of creating a community of interest across borders and structural limitation. One of the first curatorial projects I organized was an online gallery that operated for 5 years and was called orbits.com. This project was made possible because of the internet, and because of the internet, my work was able to develop independently from the mainstream infrastructure of the art world. In a way, I'm grateful for the nomadic isolation that this type of work gave me. But the more I inhabited the space for work, learning, and often socialization, the more it looked deceiving and complex, full of interfaces that control the way we behave, understand, and operate. What you see in this image is the opening page of the exhibition Truth, which look at the deceiving facade of the digital image in a times of mass discussion about misinformation. That was 2011, and it was the time of the leaks of WikiLeaks and discussion about the idea of the power of social media in making history in the context of the Egyptian revolution. The glossary points misinformation out in a few entries, such as in the post myth, hacks, and rumors. and the contemporary problem with the definition of truth also emerged in yesterday's conversation. The pandemic is being characterized by great conceptual confusion, intense speculation, and mythical stories that not only have been harmful, but have also led to the development of what I call the pandemic language, a language full of jargon borrowed by from the military. I appreciated, with irony, I suppose, one of the tags that was using for this post, new beliefs. So while being confined at home in that world home that for a few allow for performing multiple activities at once, activities that before belonged to the outside, like socializing, working, exercising, and so on. Last year, I started to feel overwhelmed, incapable of grasping the significance of what was happening. This is the reason why with Walking Studios in Bangalore, I worked on a project titled Walking the Portal. It was a series of 30-minute live interviews with creatives, researchers, artists, and writers from all over the world. And the idea was to counteract the overflow of information we were receiving by having discussions with others. Retrospectively, to me, that was an important moment of sharing and conviviality, even if remotely, and making sense of the rumors that surrounded our lives. The interviews were then turned into a PDF book that is now downloadable from the Walking Studio website, and now I show the trailer that we made for the release of the PDF. So similarly to the COVID glossary, we were interested in exploring several conceptual categories, from speculation to shape-shifting to hacktivism to inner voices to independent channels. What emerged at the end was the difficulty to make sense of the present and the importance to take a moment to pause and reflect as a group. Pausing in reality is an activity, but it often feels like being on a standstill and inert. However, projects like the Glossary, I think, along with the exhibition and this symposium, turn these into like they turn everything into like a positive moment of action. I was intrigued by the many entries that discuss the idea of self-reflection through observation and repetition, such as the entry that showed how habits of family members that before were intolerable became moments of understanding as a result of forced sharing of daily routines. Walking the Portal was also a type of archive. Over the course of the first lockdown in Bangalore, which were called 1, 2.0, 2.0, and so on, we started to map the incongruencies that were emerging from the news we were consuming, me particularly obsessively and across countries. We decided that bringing them together would allow us to at least counteract the inertia generated by the frustration that we felt when listening to some of the incongruous narratives that were circulating, and when we realized that suddenly everyone appeared less prone to dialogue as a form of exchange, particularly online. So in this sense, the entry evolved personal digital archive that is present in the COVID glossary, which is also tagged digital archive, saving and storage, open up different ways of thinking about spatial practices. Archiving, like the glossary does, allows for the emergence of diverse stories that create different conceptual movements and alliances, and therefore allows for the formation of histories that counter mainstream narratives. Archiving is a tool, the very basic tool that allows people to make sense of the world that we live in my opinion. So going back to the internet, I've been fascinated with this medium for a long time, as I said, not only in terms of curating on it, but also because it is an infrastructure with platforms and services that informs our daily lives. As it emerged from yesterday's presentation about the glossary, not only labor has been hindered during the pandemic, but it has also been exploited by the economy and its consumers, making sharply evident the power structures that are embedded in the action of many fortunate and privileged people, perhaps even before the pandemic. So in a publishing series I co-edit with artist Tara Kelton since 2015, we've been exploring the way that the digital industry has been reshaping the city of Bangalore and the relationship that people have with their environment. The piece you see here, this picture, is by Sunil Abraham and Asbury Rai, and exposes the tangible impact that algorithmic services many people use have on our environment. The pandemic has shown that our already existing ubiquitous identities have not been sustainable and do not reward labor. It looks like things change abruptly because of the pandemic, but as Mamta Sagar pointed out yesterday, there were many, and also how it was said today during the introduction, there were many underlying conditions that very often have been overlooked, either because of privilege, power structures, or laziness or unawareness. Laziness, or the inability to be agile, to use a term that appears in the glossary, is also something that has hit the infrastructure of the contemporary art world, which by being forced to confront the inability to access spaces, started to scavenge the internet to find ready-to-use platforms and channels to move their activities online. And this has happened across the world, from Italy to India and many other places. The sense of exploration, of facilitating new modes of creating art, sharing experiences with artists and with an audience, was lost in the creation of different versions of gallery and viewing rooms that would inhabit the online space, or 3D rendering of existing spaces, or VIP portals, or podcasts. So while the internet has allowed us to be connected throughout these complex and challenging times, most of the institutional examples of curatorial approaches to operating on the web and engaging with an audience online did not try to address the new conditions in which artists found themselves, often struggling to make ends meet, as well as making sense of their own work and their own practices. Projects that try to address the current moment, such as our changing relationship with public space, were very rare. One of them emerged during a webinar I organized with Walking Studios, which was titled Curating on the Web. And it is the transposition of the project 5 Million Incidents Online that was facilitated by Arushi Surana and Kaushal Sapre. The project was actually curated by Rax Media Collective in collaboration with the Goethe Institute. Surana and Sapre, in this instance, try to work with the idea of localization or localized internet, when working with a wide range of artists with different practices, who, according to them, with their project, brought in different cultures around the internet and using the internet. This idea of multiplicity of form, but also languages and structures that pertain the network environment, brings me to this idea of ubiquitousness in relation to that of performativity, and in the context of the implication of the restructuring we are perceiving during the pandemic. During the same webinar, the artist Guido Segni discussed how the URL and IRL are an opposite, but just two distinct forms in which matter can exist under different conditions. And this is interesting to me because during the pandemic, these different conditions have not been able to dialogue, and we have found ourselves to perform our physicality online, and it's a great loss, particularly in terms of our own humanity. And so in terms of the durability of such restructuring that the glossary wants to explore, I think the trick is to find ways of creating a dialogue between these two conditions and finding ways for modulating oppositions through this dialogue. To close my response, see, my work, I'm interested in exploring the means of production I adopt while curating and going about my daily life, while I'm still dwelling in the already existing, in the still existing chaos that has been exposed by the pandemic in different ways and at different levels across country. I would like to advocate for new ways of negotiating everyday life by acting on it the same way that this glossary does, by pausing for a bit to reflect, by wearing other people's shoes, as it was also mentioned yesterday, and by creating connection and exercise empathy wherever possible. And here I stop sharing my screen. I apologize for the beginning. It was very hot in my room, and that was it.
No problem. Thank you so much, Maria Laura. That was wonderful. Juxtaposing your own work along with the glossary. And I think what was interesting is the way you also began with this, what Jibesh was talking about, almost this kind of collapse of the inside and the outside. And what does it mean to kind of work with the internet and sort of start thinking of new publics that kind of, in some ways bring in and disrupt this idea of the inside and the outside. But you also, in many ways, reminded us that there have been many projects that have worked with the internet, creating public cultures, but how do you actually not replicate some of those older models, but how do you actually kind of be very specific, bring empathetic forms of engaging, so that these are not only ubiquitous, but in some ways touch our lives in multiple ways. And thank you for ending with this idea of how to make the glossary more durable, in the sense of bringing in this sense of empathy perhaps, and a dialogue that in some ways expands the imaginary that the glossary has brought in, as it connects to multiple lives. So thank you so much, Maria Laura, and we hope to kind of bring in these discussions in the end again. Thank you. Janvi, can I invite you now? Because I think this is a interesting point for Janvi to enter as well, because in some ways her own practice as a filmmaker and historian of science, but also in the ways she's kind of trying to engage public cultures, I think is very, very interesting. So Janvi is a filmmaker and historian of science and technology and the founding director of the Science Gallery, Bangalore. She has recently curated an exhibition called Contagion at the gallery, which is an important sensorial stock taking of the virus and its relationships to society. And I think that's what is most interesting for us, because Janvi in some ways brings in what perhaps will be the future of bringing in disciplinary modes that have so far been in some ways wrapped up in sort of jargon and in in academic sort of ivory towers, as I mentioned before, but bringing in this discourse to the everyday into a renewed public culture. And I think that's what is fascinating about your work, Janvi. So hope to have your responses here. Thanks.
Thank you so much. That's very kind introduction, Rupali. It's a pleasure to be back amongst some knowns. As much as the first time I learned that I am a textually driven person, or that words drive me, was when I was trying to make a film and I came back without, as my editor said, where's the B-roll? I came back with words. I came back with lots of words, right? And again, I think it was a replay of the same sensation for me as Jibesh and Maria Laura gave their responses. That I'm a very textual person. I read and I respond to words much more than I respond to images. Not that images don't move me or speak to me, but I think I still remain primarily a word-driven person. So I'll share my screen occasionally to bring some ideas to you. So thank you for mentioning the exhibition, Rupali. I've just posted the links in the chat box for those of you who might be interested. And I'm glad you mentioned that for one simple reason, because I think that will establish, apart from my being, the kind of creature I am, where I have been in the last 8 to 10 months, mentally speaking, right, or intellectually, if you like that word better, in deeply immersed, drowning in trying to bring together an exhibition at a moment where, team members tested positive, everybody's working from home, news, writing condolence messages, especially since the second wave hit on a pretty much a daily basis to people who, very close friends and family. And I think this is true for everyone. So I'm not, bringing any news here. But so this is, and while working on it and, trying to make sense of the fact that this was probably the most relevant moment to be creating a public event or a public debate around contagion, but probably the most terrifying one as well, right? Like, where it's very clear that there are probably 2 to 3 kinds of responses one would have to a public event of this kind, which is, I'm sorry, I don't have the bandwidth to deal with this right now because I have other issues to deal with. And if you are privileged and lucky enough to not have to deal with that right now, then sorry, I don't want to know anymore, because news is full of grief. Twitter is full of, everyone giving me information that I don't any longer know how to process or do things with. Or then finally that group which says, no, actually, I want to engage and I want to learn more. So, we knew that we were only looking at that bracket of people. So to know that your audience was circumscribed already, and that still they would be bringing the kind of generosity that an audience wouldn't have to in a regular time, right? Like, an audience is always generous. They give you time, they give you attention, and they expect you to engage, and they expect you to inform, they expect you to do all sorts of, different things, with them, together with them. But at this point of time, being aware completely of the kind of generosity that the audience would bring to us, sometimes terrified, sometimes in grief, was actually quite a bog to kind of walk in, knowing that the only way was down, right? Like, it was sinking, like there wasn't any good resolution of all of it. So the exhibition's been on since April 30. We had planned to close it on June 13th, and we will do a closing of the intensive programming, and I'll speak very briefly about it because I actually want to speak more to the glossary and the very intriguing possibilities it holds. What we've decided now is that we'll keep it open with monthly programming until December 31 in order for the resources to be available in the public domain, because we've put together a lot, and I'll bring them to you as and when they become relevant to the discussion later. So that's basically where I am, deep in the throes of, apart from all the logistical concerns, and you have just put together an exhibition, you know what that means, but also then the kind of pressure it brings with itself. So what I did, in fact, while Jibesh and Maria Laura were speaking, was a task I'm actually not so good at, which is multitasking. I tried to reorganize my notes around Rupali's 7 propositions. And which I thought were very interesting, because they brought a certain clarity, which I thought would be a good place to respond to, also because that, in a way, that also legitimizes what I am saying as a response. And so hear me out. I have a few things to say, which will come from the place where I am right now. It is at a distance from the kind of poetry and imagination and artistic temperament that both Jibesh and Maria Laura have brought to the discussion. But I hope what I am able to bring from the experience of having curated the exhibition might actually contribute to some way to extending our discussion. So the first point about the exposure or fissures and fault lines, right? Like a fault line, social and political fault lines that have in a way showed up. I mean, by the way, Rupali, I mean, if I may say so, your 7 points were dense. So like each point had like lots of babies in it. I mean, they were sort of kangaroo points. So it's so my responses will also kind of take that into account. So yes, so you spoke about early fault lines being sort of in a way revealed and exacerbated, and while new logistical efficiencies, as you call them, also showed up, in terms of just management of what is supposed to be daily life, other social things, and I suppose you mean your social inequalities, lack of access, etc., were also exposed. And what that wants me, what that makes me want to do is to look at, because your, in a way, proposition or your charter, so to speak, is future facing. What I would like to sort of ask, the question I would like to ask of this is, what endures? Right? Because this is not the first pandemic we have experienced in history, and we've experienced also to some degree worse. So the Spanish flu is an example. I mean, 10 to 12 million people died in India, of which we surprisingly have less visual record than one would have actually anticipated. We do have some literary record, but not actually to the extent that, again, while epidemic photography gives us records of earlier plagues and even to some extent of smallpox, we don't have the same kind of record of what was a devastating comparable pandemic, right? And so therefore, the question that I ask myself is, okay, what endures of these fissures and fault lines, and what might that allow us to think about, think about the future, so to speak, right? There are, and the reason why I raise this question is because there are, while again, the possibility of newer kinds of discussions is also there. People are also living in a mindset of a future deferred or lives deferred, right? Like, and I remember in the COVID glossary, there was one of a letter or an extract from a letter from the Canadian visa authorities about permanent residency certificate, etc. So there are futures deferred, there are lives deferred. Some not, obviously. There are some sort of people want to insist on getting married even during the second wave of the pandemic, etc. So there are those sort of incongruous, but also kind of not actually, maybe not even necessarily incongruous, but so there is that, right? Like, so what happens to that, and what also happens to the strengths or the depth of these fissures, right? Because they've been there, they've survived other pandemics, they've also survived other kinds of political upheavals, like we've seen some in the 20th century, some while we were around, others when we weren't around. And those haven't managed to dislodge some of these fault lines and fissures, right? So in a sense, can we begin to identify where the possibilities for actually opening or undermining those fissures lie? Because then, in a sense, our effort might find more reward, right? So that's one thing, and I'm happy to kind of engage in a discussion about this later, but I'll move on to speak about the other points as well. You talked about, I mean, the second point, actually, in a way, when I wrote futures deferred and lives deferred, I was also thinking about your second point, which is that of temporal reconfiguration, right? And you talked about the digital and people sort of working across time zones, etc. But it's also across sort of lifespans as well. So again, the points are connected, and you said that so yourself. The third point you mentioned was about new ideas of home and cellular sort of work and living, coming together, people in compressed sort of relationships to each other, compressed space, compressed time, etc. What in a way that brought back to me, and it was a point that I had put it down in my observations, and I'll pose that now also as a question, is that of how do we address the fragility of modernity, right? In many ways, the separation of the workspace from home space and the arrival of the factory was one sort of, pretty strong marker of modernity, where you were no longer working on the farm where you lived on the farm, or where you were no longer weaving in your backyard, or where you were no longer working where you lived, essentially, right? Like, and that was a marker of the arrival also of ideas of labor and, everything else that follows from it, the systems that follow from it, which we can also again, unpack in several interesting ways. But what does this moment do to the fragility of modernity? Also, because this is, like at all moments, the words always are such a difficult thing, I mean, at troubled moments like this in history, we've had artists, intellectuals, writers, etc., question and come up with other observations. So what are in a way our answers, right? Because this is in many ways, in many ways, this moment has its specificity, right? How are people articulating this in a way return to, not return to exactly as, but this dissolution of the workplace and home, or the living space, and the relationships that it enables and disables at the same time, right? So so basically, what is being disabled is also a question that I would like to ask, and therefore, what are the consequences for us in terms of organizing our life? What is that life going to be all about? Then I was thinking of, relating to your first point and also to your fifth point. I'm right now parking the fourth point, where you spoke about institutional cracks, post-educational spaces, public cultures around knowledge. And what spoke to me strongly was what you meant, what I understood you to mean about public cultures around knowledge. And I think this is something, I'd like to come back to, and I'd like to kind of make that a point 8 maybe, and something to explore together. But what I'd like to directly speak to this point about is, it reminded me of an experience on the beach in Puri, where Parikrama was singing, the group, the rock group, or whatever you want to call it, music group, was singing the song "We Don't Need No Education," right? And there were young people from what one might only call shanties around the beach, very happily dancing away to the music, right? Because it was on the beach, it was open to everybody. It was a happy moment. And the irony was not lost, I think, on hopefully most of us around there, which is like, no, dude. I mean, that, when does that song make sense, and in what context does it make sense, right? Like, because the digital divide has now left many people without access to education of any kind, right? And that's something, because that's something that we have to, in a way, unpack with utmost care. We were trying to do training sessions for COVID volunteers in disenfranchised neighborhoods. This was towards the sort of intensifying first wave, not the second. Youth who were from the neighborhoods, but also from elsewhere. And what we were trying to do was help them handle the shifting ground, in a sense, because there's so much uncertainty around knowledge, so much uncertainty around public health messaging, so much uncertainty around what's to be done at all, right? And so we organized sessions for them with, our colleagues in the sciences, in public health, etc. And what we found out on the very first day was they were huddled around one mobile phone, 5 of them, right? And we had we were doing a pilot with 30 of them. We were supposed to do the thing for 500 of them. It's, on the first instance, it's heartbreaking, but in the second instance, you're like, okay, how the hell do we manage this, right? So there are kids who don't have laptops, there are kids who don't have mobile phones, there are homes where there's 1 laptop and there are 3 kids, and so nothing is new to anyone in the audience right now. Everyone knows this, everyone is not only aware, but also realizes the seriousness of this. And therefore, I think, while, I'm coming myself from the, I mean, I've been an academic until I took up the leadership role in a public institution. I'm worried because this argument can be also taken to damage the possibilities or the opportunities for learning that in fact need to be made available. And in a sense, it's like the ground shifting from below the feet of those who are still waiting to get access to education, in a sense, right? So if wireless allowed us to leapfrog the bureaucracy and corruption of getting a landline, the same logical analogy will not work for education. And so in that sense, I think even as public institutions, I feel, and that's an opinion I'm willing to kind of, I'm completely open to, being challenged, and would love to discuss this in all seriousness and earnestness. We need to in fact strengthen rather and reclaim rather than think about post-educational spaces. The next point where you spoke about the hard infrastructures of health, education, and government in a way finding themselves in competition actually with care, justice, love, mutuality, charity, right? Like what held things together since the pandemic broke, when the pandemic was declared and lockdowns were declared and things started falling apart. And I think here is where, so there's a question I want to ask of it, and there's a reinforcing observation that I'd like to make, which is one where, at the same time as the hard infrastructures of health, education, and government are proving inadequate, and I think it's apparent. I mean, it's there to see. At the same time, other kinds of hard infrastructure are also taking root, which are not removed from health and especially government, right? Which is surveillance and centralization of several kinds of activities, where I cannot travel. I cannot travel until I'm vaccinated in a certain way. I cannot. My data is available. Surveillance, we know what we're talking about. Happy to unpack that in interesting ways. Hopefully, again, in order to understand where its strength lies, but also where, therefore, there is potential to create a direction for opening it up, undermining it if required. At the same time, as you very rightly said, everything from virtual communities to real life communities, people who are offering, and this is something that comes up in the glossary as well, people who are cooking and providing food for people who have tested positive and don't have a way to actually take care of themselves, right? It's simply amazing, this kind of coming together of communities. And therefore, if this is also a possibility, then how does one build on it further? What is this? If this is now centered on this experience, what can extend it? What will be the logic of its extension? Where can we call on it? And how might one actually strengthen it? Before I speak about I have about 3 more points. Language of articulation of this experience, but also you spoke in the last point about cartographies, ethnographies, new mapping, and therefore the glossary, right? Like, which is a starting point. It is, so I think it's interesting, and Miriam Ghani's film, Dis-ease, which we are showing in the exhibition season, which is available to see until June 13th. So if you have a moment, do please go have a look. Where she talks about how epidemics are, epidemic response is war, right? It has to be eradicated, it has to be controlled, it has to be conquered. It's not a public health emergency, it's a law and order situation. We had Adia Benton, who's a scholar, an ethnographer, in fact, of Ebola and AIDS in Sierra Leone, who fabulous. She started her lecture by saying, the epidemic will be militarized. Right. And I think we've seen that. We've seen that everywhere. We've seen paramilitary forces, but also the police treating this as a law and order situation, treating a pandemic as a law and order situation globally, with responses that are also drawing on the repository of responses that are available to the military, and not to health, not to public health, not to care. Right, and I think there's something very, very important happening there, and therefore, where does the language that is coming out of these communities that have arisen go? Where does it go to reside? Does it fade away? Does it sort of, where will it reside? Where will we let it nurture? Where will we let it grow and find its space and occupy occupy our imagination, occupy the ways in which we organize our lives. So if the infrastructural or state response to the epidemic is that of war, on the other hand, we have the other responses that you said of care and justice, but it's also a response of grief and loss. And so that I think is powerful, but that is also debilitating. And I think the language that comes from that comes from knowing that something that shouldn't have has gone out of control, right? Like, why is it a contagion? It's a transmission gone out of control, and that is when it's a contagion. And it very well couldn't have, it needn't have, but it did. And so I think that that experience, that language needs to find its gravity in the way we conduct our lives ahead of us, right? And I think how does one do that? How does one do that in the kind of spaces that are available to us? And finally, before I share with you a few, just a couple of things about about contagion and how we've organized it, I think, to my mind personally, and this is the point I want to add to Rupali's list, and I hope we will find ground to actually discuss this going further, is that this is an opportunity and okay, rewind, erase. This is a moment when the limits of knowledge and knowing have been exposed to their fullest. Given the sort of availability of information, and therefore, infodemic, it's I think what has been difficult to manage during this pandemic is the ubiquity and the sheer relentlessness of information from sources that we are unable to judge has been extremely difficult. And for those of you who are interested, there's a very interesting workshop that we've organized, which will happen next Sunday. I'll put it in the chat box later in a second. But I think coming to, speaking as a historian of science, as someone who is trying to establish a space that intersects the domains, or not even domains, the mandates, actually, the mandates of the human and natural sciences with art and engineering. I think it's the limits to knowledge and knowing, the uncertainty of truth claims and shifting evidence, and how does one learn to respect that shifting knowledge doesn't mean what was put to you earlier by sources that you could trust was in some way a conspiracy or a lie, but that's the only way in knowledge, in ways that's the only way in which knowledge can move and move ahead. And therefore, I think this is a moment where we can create for all of us here who have studied in Indian schools, we used to have something called critical appreciation as an exercise in English language class. And that's what I like that idea now when I remember it, although when, at that point of time, it was like, yeah, okay. But I think this is a moment where we have the ability, we have evidence in the public domain to reinforce the necessity for a critical appreciation for research, both in the human and the natural sciences, because without that, we wouldn't even know what was going wrong. We wouldn't even know what was going wrong. And so there is at one level the tragedy and the poetry of our lives, the limits and yet the sort of the limits and yet sort of the infinite, not infinite, the sort of expanse of our experience. And I'm not even talking about imagination, I'm just talking about our experience. There is that thing which is knowledge, which is being produced with great effort and sort of, at times also risk, in order to be able to control what shouldn't have gone out of control. Vaccines, medicines, care, drugs, all of this work is happening. And those who are doing this work are also amongst us. They are also us. And I think how, therefore, might one come to appreciate that there are limits to knowing, there are limits to knowledge, and those limits need to be pushed. One need to be asking critical questions, but one should not turn away from that. That is, to just give an analogy that is different to this one to make my point or to reassert my point. I don't think today, and this is something I've said earlier in public fora, so forgive me those who have listened to this earlier, you cannot teach a class in political science today without an understanding of algorithms and social media and what goes into coding of public opinion at the back ends of news houses and social media, because otherwise you are not giving your students the tools to understand and analyze how democracy is being either strengthened or undermined. And so therefore, disciplinary silos in the classroom, in life, don't make sense. That doesn't mean people shouldn't have disciplinary strengths. They should come with those strengths, but that is the moment at which they expand. The questions need to come from life. The questions don't need to come from the lab. The questions don't need to come from the conference, and they don't need to come from politics. They need to come from life. And so I think that, is a point that I'd like to bring in a way back. So, when I was struggling to find what would be the vision statement, in a sense, for Science Gallery in India, it took me a year and lots of angst because it had to be simple enough to make sense. It had to be important enough to be accepted. And at the same time, it had to do the work it was supposed to do. And so I finally settled on the goal is to bring science back into culture, right? And I think that's the task I'd like to, in a way, invite all of us to do together, and expand this discussion beyond sort of where it stands currently. So allow me now to just quickly. Okay, before I do that, I will just paste here the workshop on AI-supported response to social listening. This is about infodemics and social media. And I'll put a couple of other links, but I will just do that before I show you quickly what it is that we have tried to do with Contagion at our end. Okay, so this is not the landing page of the exhibition, but this is sort of the menu page. So all of this, so there is an exhibition, there are 16 exhibits, there is a program that I think about, I don't remember how many, but we have 23 public lectures, about 16 workshops. We have workshops and masterclasses. We have 5 films that are there to see through the duration of the exhibition. We have 3-minute videos. So this was a way of doing that work where you don't expect someone trained in history to just willingly and easily be able to both want to and be able to watch an epidemiologist speaking for 45 minutes. So we make 3-minute long videos with experts where they share with us the top 3 questions on their mind as to why their research is relevant to why their research is relevant to the pandemic, or the questions that we need to be asking. And those questions come from the current experience, but draws on their decades-long experience. So they're called COVIDs. A colleague of mine came up with the name. So the films are here. This is Miriam Ghani's film, which I spoke about. Where Birds Dance Their Last is a very short Vietnamese film about farmers who basically are rearing ducks for export to China, and the fear of bird flu in which they live. Survivors is a film by Sierra Leone's filmmaker Kolatha Pratt, which is about Ebola. A Human Question is T. Jaishrie's film about HIV/AIDS in India and also elsewhere. And this is an animation film. So we have social rooms, so reading rooms, so full books as well, so that are available online, etc. A reference list for those. For other books to read. Listening room, we've put together 4 playlists. Yeah, my vocabulary fails me. Playlists with a selection of audio events or podcasts or from across the world that speak to the themes that we have, which is trigger, transmission, spillover, and the big picture. This is where we have open source games. And the idea behind this is, to get young adults to come in a manner in which they find most comfortable before they go here anywhere. So if they're into games, they can start here, or they can start here, and then, find their way here. But it's this section that I want to speak about because this speaks to the glossary in some ways. So Through Your Eyes was something we organized with the Chennai Photo Biennale, where we asked for photo submissions from, as an open call, and we received some very interesting photos with, writings. And so when I was going through the COVID glossary, I was reminded a lot of, the kind of responses we got. We put up, of course, only a selection of them, but they're very, very intriguing. My favorite is this one, although, oh shoot, this is on public forum, please edit it out. I shouldn't say that. These are all young people. This spoke to me. It was quite intriguing. Damn it. Sorry, so we already did this. And In Your Words was we asked for writing prompts. So we asked people to respond to our writing prompts. So we got poetry, we got essays, and we got them also not only in English, but also other languages, other Indian languages. So with that, I will stop sharing my screen. And thank you again, Rupali and Prasad, for the opportunity to share with you my thoughts and my experience. And it's great to be among friends again. So thanks.
Thanks so much, Janvi, for bringing in, coming at this kind of discussion of the glossary from your own experience of running a kind of public institution that in some ways is, that in some ways is trying to open up the discourse, like as I mentioned before, of something that is otherwise siloed. And I think you said that here, but also you brought in questions of if there is a sense of the future, then what is it that endures? You brought in questions of what happens when there is what happens to times when people are constantly deferring the future and sort of in the state of limbo almost, and in some ways also kind of bringing in your own, and I think it probably also comes from your own practice of kind of engaging in public culture, where does that sort of limit lie, right? Like where does that divide exist? But maybe in this sense, maybe it might be interesting to bring in Jivesh here also in the next discussion, because moment you talk about divide, is there a kind of rupture possible where, thinking through Rancière, is there a kind of possibility of thinking of an equality that comes from somewhere else, right? So that might be an interesting kind of discussion to have in the end. But also your provocations of thinking of languages of articulation. What does it mean to think through these languages? And I think, what was most interesting is the way you sort of ended, and again, coming very closely from your own experiences of running this institution, but also this exhibition, which is so closely related to the glossary in many ways, where you're talking about a sense of, what does it mean to kind of develop a public culture of criticism, right? What does it mean to kind of bring this discourse up against, and in some ways it's also kind of how do you, what is the language of that discourse also then, right? Like how do you deal with that? Is there, how is it different probably from academic papers?
Yeah.
Right? What does it mean to kind of, work with the logistics of this language, not to dumb it down, but, bring in another culture of dialogue and discussion that is probably not based in jargon, right? But in some ways also bringing a kind of language to the everyday, which is not I mean, it's not a dumb science for dummies, right? Like, so I think that will be an interesting way of bringing, because there's always a kind of patronization often, right? Like when you talk about science, how do we talk about it through this idea of, science for dummies? But that's not the public culture that we want to generate, right? So then what is that kind of discourse and how does that exist? That might be a very interesting discussion again to have. So yeah, so thank you. And with that, I'm going to invite Prasad Shetty, my colleague, to come in with to moderate this panel. Thanks.
Thanks. Very nice. All three of you. I mean, so many dimensions opened. Diptika, you can let more people in. Yesterday's panelists, whoever are there, whoever wants to get in, you can open up this whole thing. Meanwhile, I'll kind of start, because we have, I think, half an hour left. I think I have loads and loads of notes which I'm going to write to each of you all about asking, so many clarifications, and so many clarifications also happened. So I think one thing which happened through the glossary, and which happened yesterday also, and also which happened today, is the idea of the we, us, and we started talking in we and us terms, more sharply, actually. I think that's a very important dimension when faced with this, and that is I think is also the power of the times and the power of the pandemic, that kind of pushed us in these we and us terms. And here, and here, I think that, and I launch my not questions, but the coordinates of the conversation, and ask each one of you all to respond very specifically on that we question, because y'all try to hold the we question in very specific ways, in very specific ways, actually. The idea, for example, the idea of the reconfiguration of geometries, which Jibesh brings in, and the idea of mutuality. And I want to distinguish here between mutuality and reciprocity. Reciprocity is a contract-based kind of, but mutuality is also contractual, but in a very different, non-judicial contract, actually. So my question to Jibesh would be to kind of, if you can sketch out for us some coordinates of the geometries of this mutuality, which will probably become the infrastructure to kind of locate oneself through the pandemic, and also to kind of, I'm not kind of, making it in opposition to state or to kind of, larger structures or anything like that. I'm saying that there is a shifting, and all of us, all the presentations since yesterday, the glossary, other readings have indicated this. There is a reconfiguration of the, and nicely, and the way you kind of put together as geometries, the geometries of life, actually, the geometries. So they're getting reconfigured, and one of the anchor over here is the mutuality. One of the conceptual entity is the idea of mutuality. So what are the geometries of mutuality? What could be the geometries of mutuality? So I'll ask all three questions together, and then you all can respond. To Maria Laura, again, the idea of handling and dealing with the fragments, because in all the works you speak about the fragments and the fragments beyond lists, and we have forms in which we have dealt with the fragments, lists and collages and overlaps and constellations. There are plenty of forms to kind of think about a fragmented idea of which cannot be kind of held together in broad conceptualizations, which cannot be held together with meta narratives. But what are the ways in which, what are the forms that one could kind of think about to engage with these fragments? And you also brought in the question of archivist, the archive, and I'm just thinking, the difficulty of the archivist in this case, because how do you deal with with material which is constantly kind of growing, where categories are impossible, where things are kind of not in place, and what you see is the world itself is as a large archive. How do you then kind of there is no single archive that can be put together or anything or something like that. So because you cannot. So I would like you to speculate on the form of how do you deal with fragments. And Janvi actually brought in very beautifully the question of shifting, or the question of shifting. I would call it evolving, because that also kind of relates back to Jibesh's idea of the normal is kind of is dynamic. It's kind of it's not a static normal. It's kind of it has always been a evolving normal. So and the thing is that whenever we kind of set terms for transactions, we set terms on the basis that the normal is a fixed entity. That you need to kind of for this ailment, this is the medicine. For this action, this is the thing. For this thing, and the kind of a and you can see it across. So when the when you have a situation which is evolving and shifting, and you said yourself, the knowledge systems are also kind of constantly transforming and evolving, and you brought in without the sense of algorithms and hacks and codes, it is impossible to teach anything today. I agree with you completely. Like it's something which I felt always. Like I'm thinking, and you brought in the questions need to come from life, which also we at sea are constantly kind of thinking about. So if you can also speculate about the form of that engagement with a evolving dynamic set of knowledge, where suddenly you'll find yourself not a docile recipient of something and then kind of acting, but an active participant in this shifting terrain of knowledge, life, etc. So what are the ways in which a new institution, for you it is a museum, but for a new institution, what are the terms by which it can be kind of made growing or so these are the three broad questions. I have plenty of questions. I don't think we have any time left. We'll have kind of so if each one of you can kind of broadly respond to them, it will be very nice. Divesh?
See, Prasad, mutuality is something that it's a kind of a dormant category normally. Kind of swarm through different kind of logics of transaction, of entrepreneurship, and all kinds of logics have been. But what we see in the last year, and then also in the last 2 months primarily, is the emergence of a recognition of each other to live and float and actually recognize the stranger and multiplicities of stranger as your own in a way that I have not experienced. I have seen it in the sports, I've seen it in classrooms, I've seen it among friends, so-called, but I have not seen in this scale. I have seen it in the, say, a football ground when there is a riot, people will try to save each other. But I've not seen it in this scale on a daily life, sustained over months. Now, where is it? Obviously, it is not something that people have discovered sui generis suddenly because oxygen was in. There is a latent flow that has got a subterranean flow that has got expressed. What I'm think my idea is that that expression has a certain infrastructural implication, infrastructural imprint. It changes the way infrastructure is to be seen, like the whole idea of the care work being rethought, like the whole idea the digital is being rethought. What Maria Laura was talking about, that the digital space becomes not only a space that you are getting information, it's a habitation. It's a form of habitus. You know, that you cannot just say that I've got my information for that. So it's a kind of little, and you know, it is connects to Janvi's asking of what happens to specialized knowledge. There is like a lot of my friends are scientists, and one of my biggest quarrels, some of them have become nonsense. They have become anti-science. They are scientists in the day and night. They're anti-science. I meet them in the anti-science mode. And that is the vacuum, that is the void that I keep on trying to understand. Why did people who studied at 80s landed up with great technological jobs, but completely anti-science? Listen to Ramdev talking nonsense, and they send me WhatsApp. And then you realize there's something fundamentally wrong. They're PhDs. So it is not question of, there is something fundamentally got awry. And then on the other side, you see Lancet editorials being debated publicly. Okay, so much so that the PMO sends tweets on it. So such is the kind of a circulatory pressure that builds around a Lancet edit. Lancet is a fairly peer-reviewed journal. In India, it has a little checkered history in controversies of national science versus international science that humiliates or does not understand, the Indian resentment, which keeps on circulating. But the question is this: making Lancet accessible as a public discourse, writing on it, is also the act that I think has to be understood as an act of mutuality, act of recoding the way science is to be lived in this. So there are a lot of this, I would say, there are a lot of this markers that is happening around us, which tells us something about a certain way the grounds are shifting, in which both knowledge and the way we have to materially read into each other. And you know, like a lot of urban life has been that. Like Soli was saying a few minutes back to in a message, that a lot of urban life has had that kind of mutual recognition framework, and a critique of urban life's estrangement from mutuality, which is a classic critique, is accident victims not being taken home, taken to the hospital. This fundamental critique from childhood, we are hearing it, is based on the idea of forgetting of mutuality, not forgetting. It's a kind of a daily life catastrophic recounting of that. Do not forget it. And then there is a police apparatus reading, you know, like if you take it, you will get arrested, that kind of thing. But it has never happened to me, but it has happened to people I hear. But what is it that forgetting, reminding you of mutuality, clearly shows in the negative here, clearly shows that something else. So I'm saying that what one have to work in this kind of dispositional rethinking and infrastructural rethinking to arrive at some kind of understanding of a category that has got misplaced. Anarchists worked with it for some time. Then they also got misplaced into state anti-state debate. And this heavy thing called the state also displaces all the other categories. And I think what I liked about the glossary was this: they are not distracted. This heavy base. Even You're seeing sleeping people on the station, police beating up, everything. But they're not at one level, I don't know, something that stops them from becoming kind of social reformists asking for petitioning of the social. So that is what I was trying to say, that something else may be operative, which we can tease out and think through from our own dispositional reading of our own worlds. Here, own don't mean just me and yours. It's the words that has been narrated through literature, through cinema, through everyone.
Thanks. I mean, the infrastructure dimension of mutuality and one clue of how does one engage with forgetting. I think that how does one engage with forgetting? What does it? How does forgetting play out in this condition? Is something I think we'll take it ahead. These are two important points, definitely. Yeah. Marilora, you want to come in to respond? I can't hear.
Sorry.
Yeah.
You asked me a difficult question. So about these fragments, I think on an abstract level, there are maybe two things that are important to bring these fragments together. And one is dialogue, and the other one is questioning. And I mean, this is, I guess this is probably always been applied to our lives, but I mean, in my experience of this past year is the more information we received and the more protocols we started to follow. So we started to kind of lead our lives according to protocols or following rules, etc., etc. The more they've made us prone to open-mindedly questioning something. And while, for example, we've been receiving these fragments of information from everywhere, it's a personal observation. It's almost like by being inside, by being performing our bodies online, it's become very different to, I think it's very difficult to understand each other. I found that there's been much more like judgments and opinions. So in terms of like bringing these fragments together, it's more like, it came up in the conversation, in the conversation like with all of these speakers, is this idea of maybe perhaps creating like this sort of constellation where different people come to this idea of different centers where different people come together. See, the fact that this fragmentation, I think for me, comes from the lack of actually experiencing the public space. For me, it's also very different the way that I experience the public space if I'm in Italy or if I'm in India. It's the fact that with the lack of the public space, we lack this idea of like negotiating and encountering differences and trying to fit in and trying to understand. So I think that this bringing fragments together, will necessitate also to have this dialogue, which is also a dialogue between the opposites that we've been living, being online, being offline, being aware of the news, not being aware of the news. It's almost like I feel that we've been living like according to dichotomies right now, inside, outside. It came out today and we started all to get confused, like the image that GB showed from like your glossary archive. You don't know who's the outsider, the insider, the house. So the dialogue to me would be like a dialogue that allows us to use less opposites, or oppositional definition, and allow for differences to come back. Because I think we've all been living in sort of bubbles. Which I mean, we've also created like bubbles in order to, there's been bubbles of support, for example, that have been very necessary, but at the same time, they are much more control spaces than than what is needed to in order to move forward and create new configurations, like which is what we are talking about. So I don't have a specific response.
But the idea of dialogue and interrogation, I think, and your earlier idea, which also Jivesh mentioned, inhabiting the fragments and kind of figuring out ways to navigate it. I think those definitely have clues, like how does one kind of allow these fragments to pass through you, and where everybody becomes an archivist, and and because the world appears to you in these fragments only, and that's a question that you kind of posed, how and one is, of course, there's a charm of keeping it in the fragmented state, keeping it in kind of fragmented state. Yeah, thanks. Janvi, you want to come in?
Yeah, so it's a good question to which I have some, I have sort of baby step answers. It's a question that occupies day and night, and my day and night, and also we've been experimenting with it, my team and I, for the last 4 exhibitions that we put together, because this is central, right? Like, and I think you hit the nail on the head when you asked. So when you asked this question, because the way I have been phrasing it is reticence. My in many ways, what we need to do with the gallery, but also what I've seen my work as a historian of science, is to address this reticence between research and the public, right? And in the public, I mean, I include everyone from an accountant to a physicist, right? Like, so there is this distance, and how does one bridge that distance? And I find the word estrangement also a good one, because when I look back in history, this wasn't the case. And my favorite story is that many of us are aware of at the back of our head, but have in a way forgotten that C.V. Raman, the country's sort of first science Nobel laureate, who studied, lived, worked, died in this country, and didn't go anywhere else apart from a few travels, of course. For the first, when he was recognized internationally as a researcher in acoustics, and invited, the only Asian, well, not only the only Asian, but the only foreigner invited to write a chapter in the Handbuch der Physik by the Germans in 1927, did all of that work while he was an accountant by day. He was with the Indian Accounts and Audit Services. He was doing his science in the evening. And where was he doing it? He was doing it, as Jivesh will know, at the Indian Association for Cultivation of Science, which was a public laboratory, a public space where anyone who wanted and was interested in science could do so. So a lawyer like Ashutosh Mukherjee could come and teach and give lectures, public lectures in mathematics. So it was a space where in a way, you could inhabit many roles, and you could inhabit many bodies of knowledge, but you occupied them with an intensity that was not that of someone walking by, but as an accountant for 10 years to sustain a research project which eventually would lead to a Nobel Prize is not trivial, right? And so what do I mean by that? What I mean by that is that while we have tried in several ways to bring science to the public by saying, here's something you should know, and that's primarily behind science communication. And I don't underestimate the value of that. Science communication is important. But there's something else that needs to be done again, which is to take the public into the lab, which is which shouldn't become a space to which they have inhibition or reticence or feel an estrangement from. It's what I often say is, for a country which pushes its young into professions in engineering and only to some extent in science, but still,
nice.
in that domain. And so therefore we have a very strong professionalized conversation around these, around science, around engineering. We don't have a cultural conversation around these at all. We can't, I can't imagine very easily dialogues around, so why the hell does circuit drawing exist? Or when did circuit drawing come into being, and why does that matter as a dining room conversation? As opposed to say, what rank is this university, and therefore, where do you want to get admission in America, and therefore which company would you like to work in after that, right? So these the cultural conversation around science, where reliable knowledge matters, and its reliability also matters, is something that is at the heart of the work that we need to do, and we need to do it collectively, because these silos aren't sustainable. I'm not, again, and I want to reassert here, I am not arguing against deep disciplinary training, but I'm arguing against silos of questions, where basically, and this is also being undermined today in another way, where, newer institutions that claim to be educational institutions, and especially where it interfaces with industry, are trying to replace knowledge making with problem solving, right? Like, why aren't we solving problems, right? And so therefore you don't need to get deep training in physics, don't need to get deep training in biology, you need to understand problems, and you need to work towards them, right? And that is also problematic. So that's not the place where I'm coming from. But what I'm trying to say is that, where do questions come from? Where do research questions come from? Where do good research questions come from? And I think that that needs to be addressed. And in order to have all of this, right, like this class, it's asking a lot of us as citizens, as people, right? Like, and by citizens, I don't mean of a nation state, but of this world. As people, I think it's how to assess the reliability of knowledge being shared with you is the skill that people need to develop. So to come finally to the question that you asked me, how does one engage people such that they are able to deal with a moving target that is uncertain knowledge, or evolving knowledge, as you called it, where you're not a docile recipient but a proactive agent, right? How does one do that? And I think critical to that is the ability to judge reliable knowledge. And that ability is what can be given by having conversations, not in the content of science, but conversations about what science is, about what engineering is. And again, sciences for me are both human and natural sciences. So knowledge from sociology around the study of suicides, around family, is as important as, dark matter or public health.
Thanks, Janvi. The estrangement of labs, and or the exclusion environment of the lab of the university, or some case, and the cultural dimension of science. I think these are the two coordinates you have kind of put on the table for us to kind of chew. How do you kind of think of those institutional shifts, to engage with the evolving realm of knowledge? There are plenty of questions. I'll invite one by one. Sanjay, you are here. You can ask your question, actually. Sanjay?
Yeah, sure. I can. Yeah, this to Jibish as well as Maria Laura. I'll simply read the question out. Empty city, empty sky. Saturn is indeed a gripping beauty through a telescope, but with the pollution in city, the starry sky has been absent for several years. The pandemic bringing back nature would also hopefully clear the skies, to make the celestial bodies visible again. The fruit and tabletop images by you and Maria Laura create constellations born out of obsessive compulsive sanitization, which we are all going through. Ditto screenshots and filing systems that Maria Laura showed. Is the inherent need for order making or pattern seeking being heightened as a response to getting unnaturally confined in space-time? What are the other possible heightening of perceptions, and how would these play out in the post-pandemic scenario? This to both Jibish and Maria Laura, or anyone who would.
No, thanks for the question. You know, like those images are from the glossary.
Yeah.
They're not my images. You can say I like being called as my images. I would pass it off, but there are authors are all around, so I can't pass it off as my image. Those are images I glossed from the glossary. The reason I showed it in a certain way, because if you see the pattern is one part of it, it is basically, it moves towards a highly inflamed imaging, you know, where the desires expresses and, you know, objects, which the fridge, the last image was the object of the fridge, which doesn't anymore work as a fridge. It starts working as something else. Now, the main question that I'm interested in is not this pollution. You know, if you talk to a amateur astronomer, and I saw the Saturn because of the gift of a amateur, she took us to see Saturn. It is basically, if you talk to them, they will tell you 10 times you can see Saturn in a certain way in 3 months. So it is question of that, you know, like it is a question that they do see Saturn, and it is not because of pollution that they are inhibited. And same way, I think some friends of mine from argue that the dust storm, if we have the dust storm as an image to make sense of the world, because that is what carries in West Asia and Africa in a large number, and people do see the world through that also. It is not the visibility is clean, no storm. World sees through storms and this, you know. So this idea of the clear sky is a very new idea. You know, these are, you know, what happens with this idea, the new invention of the climate has brought in this new fiction of the climate also, as if humans had, you know, saw a sky, you know, the description of the volcano in Indonesia of volcanoes are incredible. You want that sky almost, like you read the you know, like things like that. So I think we have to learn what are we actually seeing, and the sensuousness of being has to be got back. I'm more interested in that. For me, washing of that vegetables and keeping the misfit of the chili and the tomatoes are, for me, a very fascinating entry into the way the failure of urban, how photography do not get the urban sometimes. They see urban as a catastrophe versus the successful. That's the nightmare urbanism. India is divided into a nightmare urbanism versus gated urbanism. If you see all our 90% of our theory is the unruly street, urban nightmare, and the gated urbanism. So that produces, you know, I say a disallowing of seeing. What I saw in the glossary is a renewal of seeing. That's all I was saying.
Wonderful. Thanks. Thank you very much, Jibish.
I mean, if I can add to that, I mean, do we still have time, Prasad?
Yes, we have time. We'll take another 10 minutes. Yeah.
Okay, so I mean, maybe I'll distinguish between the two, although they might have something in common. I mean, I think that this idea of like obsession of sanitization, I mean, comes from the fact that there's this visible entity that just everyone is just trying to put. It's just it comes from the fact that we are tackling something invisible, and it's related to that idea of fear. So maybe I would relate that less to the idea of like making order, although it has like, I mean, it's actually also quite related to order, giving some order to something that moves around and you cannot see. But the other idea of like making order, so that idea of archiving or maybe obsessively archiving, I think it actually comes from like counteracting, it goes back to what Prasad was saying, like counteracting like the fact that there are like so many fragments that of like story, facts from all over the world, uber local, super local, and then at the same time coming from the other side of the hemisphere, that it becomes like a way for people in different way to try to make like some sort of order. And I think it's also related to the fact that we've been very disengaged with our bodies and therefore with our senses. So the only actually way to making sense is just spending time with these little bits and pieces. It's almost like ordering like fruits and vegetables on the table, for example. But I don't, it's a compassion that comes from fear of not understanding, I feel. That's what I want to say. In terms of the pattern of the future, I think that I hope that this will not become a pattern for the future. Like this fact that we are disengaged with ourselves, our senses, the outside, the fear. It certainly doesn't help us to be human, actually. So, yeah.
Thanks. Rishabh, you wanted to come in with your question? Sorry, anybody wants to?
Yeah. So a lot of ideas to think through and deliberations around the coexistence of mutuality after the presentations, made our understanding more clear. And I was loving the part when Jibesh was talking about various propensities. So, in my hometown, the government has loosened some restrictions. So now it's called a modified lockdown. So 5 to 11 a.m., the whole market is open. It's very congested. And also this is a propensity, so this is a propensity consolidated by the state government, and which is interestingly consolidated propensities of the public. And some people have made it as a compulsive behavior to go to the market in that time period, regardless of their need. And maybe because they want to make sure that they are still part of the city. I actually was also thinking about, I was thinking about Laura's ideas of institutions that disrupted, and and we have immediately resorted to the digital medium, which is an immediate translation of the ways we used to operate before COVID, and which is not very engaging, as you rightly said. And some of us have started to fall out of this system. And towards the end of last academic year, the communication gap was so substantially grown, and the engagement were also so reduced. And I've been thinking about more empathetic ways, but then we are limited by the boundaries of these interfaces that we use to operate. And since you have already been thinking about it for more time, I am asking this question to Maria Laura. And since you've already been thinking about it for more time, can you project some of the possibilities to increase the engagement and get that possibilities to increase engagement and get the dialogue going? And I have a question for Janvi also. I don't know if we have time, but I'll just ask it anyway. Janvi, you're talking about the fragility of modernity. So how do we address that? It's just and you also talked about the limits of knowledge. It's kind of hello.
I couldn't hear the second part of what you said.
So second part, you also mentioned about the setting the limits of knowledge. Actually, I thought I misinterpreted it. I don't know. It's impossible to set the limits of knowledge, no? What was that part you're talking? Set the limits of knowledge, and to turn our faces from that. Just very confusing.
Thanks, Rishabh. Any responses to this?
May I go? I'll just quickly, because both questions are very, very answered very quickly. No, so Rishabh, no, I did not say we turn our faces and limit our. What I said is there are limits to knowing and there are limits to knowledge. What we know is very little. What we are able to know or what we are able to claim to know is also very little, right? So there are limits to knowing and there are limits to the knowledge that we have. So in that, we need to come to terms with that, and therefore also interpret our own understanding and the understanding of those we trust using that lens. So that's what I meant. And in terms of how to deal with fragility of modernity, it's always been fragile. It's always been fragile. And it is in moments of crisis that the fragility is exposed. And therefore, again, asking questions, as Jivesh and Maria Laura and Prasad have already said, pushing questions, pushing the limits, asking questions are and not sort of in a sense, how should I put it? In a way, it sounds so my generation, right, Jivesh? I mean, it feels a bit kind of, not putting your faith in, in these categories is, and it's something we are doing already. So, it's not, it's something, again, that we live with. It's not something that can be addressed in the sense of, it's something that has to be dealt with, right? So, and I think Jivesh might have a more poetic answer to that than mine.
Jivesh, you want to, sorry.
No, please, please.
Yeah. No, you, Maria Laura, please.
No, I just want a clarification on the question. Was your question related to what institutions could do to engage people online?
Yeah.
Empathetic.
In a way, yes.
Yeah, yes. I mean, there's been like responses from, there's a long history of curating online and engaging audience in online, which is like more than, it's kind of like 30 years old. I think, and what happened actually is that during the pandemic, there was also like many people that used to work online and organize many projects online that actually stopped organizing projects online because this online space started to be like filled by like so many events. Like it was said today, it was like the year of the webinars, and it started to actually lose its meaning because what was actually lacking was the outside space. So what I was saying, I do understand the institution, have to, keep on engaging with their audience, but there are examples of institutions who, like independent curators who have organizing exhibitions on the wall of a building so that people who will go outside during the hours where they could go outside to buy necessity, they could actually come across an exhibition that then would have something else online. So I think there are very different, it requires more thinking about again, that kind of like, this year, many of the things happen like in this realm of dichotomy. The outside doesn't exist, therefore the physical doesn't exist, therefore I go online. But with very little thinking about how you can create new dialogues between these two spaces in a moment where there are many limitations and restrictions, and everything became about broadcasting and publishing and filling social media with more and more images and more content. And I think that's where the disengagement comes. We don't have that kind of engagement online. It's already even right now very difficult for me being sitting down in the same place for 3 hours. My brain starts like going somewhere else. So there are various different ways of doing it, but it has to start from questions: who do I want to engage and why and how? And then I think the format comes. I hope I kind of replied to the question.
Thanks.
Jivesh, you want to go to the...
See, this is a very tricky because we know, like digital, you follow football, Rishabh. In football, the players are very unhappy for having lost the fans. And football machine is going on, like IPL, it's going on. Football. But, in that midst, what happened was that the football big honchos, people with money and owners of club, realized that their viewership, they are no longer Barcelona of Barcelona. They're no longer Barcelona of Spain. They're no longer Barcelona of Western Europe. They suddenly realized Barcelona is now a phenomena being watched by billions. So they cooked up this whole idea of Super League, which then the physical fans came to the streets and started throwing stones and breaking the windows. even the English Prime Minister got a little nervous that it may lead to some kind of huge social revolt. So we do not know the new cartographies and the older cartographies embedding and disembedding. So your teachers and yourself are also in that same space. There is a certain disembedding is happening. I can feel it because I've done in last 1 year more conversation with people in the world than I have done in 10 years. So I do not know what does it mean to my head. I actually do not know. I do not know what does it mean to the processing power of my own thought process. And do not forget, the moment it started, there was a recording sign. It's still on. This becomes archive. It is put online. You have already become a fuel to a new processing. So you cannot repeat I cannot repeat what I've said. Earlier, I repeated fairly large amount of stuff in traveling. So what is happening now, there's a transformation and your classroom would be a good test to see this. There is an unembedding and a re-embedding of some new zone that is appearing, which may have to be totally rethought. What exact, and we won't return back to an older form. Do not even have that idea. Whoever is propagating that idea is propagating falsehood. There is no return. It is going to be something else, but there is no return. It never happened in the world. So we have to rethink. The glossary. That's why the glossary is interesting. That experience, the loss of empathy, as well as the connection. That experience is specific. That has to be spoken. Earlier, as if the classroom was also same. By the way, I hated my classroom all my life. So it was the site of empathy was friendships. Where a friend would narrate a book for 3 hours, and you will feel, oh wow, that was the book, a story from a book. But the classroom was a torment. Sorry for that, Prasad.
Yeah, no, very nice, very nice. There is one specific question to Jahnavi from Lantian, who says he's orbiting somewhere. So the question is, what does it mean to call public into the lab when we are already vaccine jabbing on planet scale? So what does it really mean to kind of call? Because yeah, you want to respond to it?
Sure. I think it's a clever question. I'm sure Lantian himself or herself, it's himself, right?
Himself.
Yeah, himself knows that he's sort of being polemical and clever, which sounds extremely good when you have a glass of wine in your hand. But unfortunately, we are not in that situation. We are online. No, so I'll tell you what. It's of course experiments are carried out in the real world, but it's the intent that is very, very important to separate what is being offered as a public health measure versus an intent to experiment and an intent to grow knowledge or an intent to produce knowledge. And I think that is not something that is reducible to polemic alone, because vaccine jabbing across the planet is not an experiment. And it's not an experiment because if we claim that, we are undermining the histories of everything from Edward Jenner to all attempts therefrom, and the histories of actually having eradicated or nearly eradicated smallpox, nearly eradicated polio. So there are histories to what vaccines are able to do and what vaccines are not able to do, and there is uncertainty, but that doesn't amount to calling it the same thing as an experiment. So what happens in a lab is a controlled experiment in order to produce knowledge. It might be conducted in the field too. Clinical trials are a part of that, but there has to be control. And therefore, a clinical trial is deemed to have failed if those controls are actually absent, and if there is no fidelity to process, and if there is no, if it's carelessly or sloppily done, and then one has the right to actually call such a vaccine improper. And there are people who do that on a regular basis. So what I mean by giving people access to the lab is what I mean by giving people access to the lab is giving them access to understanding the assumptions behind experiments, how experiments are conducted, how knowledge is produced, how it could be in the field, labs and fields are both included in this. What are the methods? And also understanding, therefore, at the end, and this is something that speaks to the point I made at the end, which is the limits to knowing and limits of knowledge, or where one has to understand that all truth claims are underdetermined by evidence on offer. But those can be questioned and those can be pushed ahead if new evidence comes along. And I think that is, again, something one needs to respect, because, we all, we're talking about health right now. It's the easiest thing. It's often sort of a very morally loaded argument to make, but when you're ill, you need a hospital, and you need to trust that people who are offering you cures and treatments, and especially in interventionist treatment, that people have thought this through, people have understood what they're doing, and this applies for everything from medicine to bridges. When I drive or walk on a bridge, I want to know it will not fall. When I go in a train, I want to know it will not necessarily derail, right? Like, so there are many things. Engineering, sciences, science, yes, there are limits. Truth claims can be questioned and must be questioned. And, evidence, truth claims are always underdetermined by evidence. One needs to understand that very, very seriously. So yes, it's great polemics. We've done that when we were young, to say there's an experiment being conducted in the world by everybody getting jabbed. No, it's not an experiment. It's a public health measure. An experiment looks something different. Intent is important.
Thanks, Janvi. We are 20 minutes off, and I'm going to read out some of the comments and questions over here. We won't have time to kind of discuss it further. Deepti's question, I think, is directed to the group. What happens to this record? Actually, I don't know what happens to the records. Everything we are recording, and it is almost, there is another parallel universe which is getting built with all the records and so many hours of records and recordings, and the fragments. How do we see the glossary in the next 5 years, 10-year horizon? What happens to these personal narratives? What happens to these people? And all of those questions. At the moment, those are questions that one needs to kind of pick up more seriously. Yes, we will pick that up. There is a point from Lantian. He says the us is invoked as a wide radiating us, not humanist us, but the alive us. And there is Sabi's response to it. I think there is an important distinction between the humanist discourse versus a discourse around life, forms of living, and where mutualities are entangled across spheres. And I'm going to expand on that to kind of leave it there. We'll close, and I want to close with, first of all, thanking Academy of the Arts in the World at Cologne for this project, Times of Hand, and also who kind of brought together three institutions as the Academy of Media Arts at Cologne, as well as the Federal University in Rio. Also thanking at this moment the Maxwell Bhavan and the Goethe Institute here in Mumbai. The next set of symposium in this series is next week at 4 p.m. Presented by the Academy of Media Arts in Cologne. It will be available in the website of the Academy of Arts of the World. With that, I want to kind of go back to 2 points. I think I would like to close there, and both the points from Jibesh, actually the beauty of the volcano. I think that's an important kind of space to think about, and the howl in the emptiness, which also was a reading from the street photograph. I think how does one invoke and work through these energies and these beauties, which are otherwise kind of, kept aside, or like you said, the volcano is beautiful in variety of ways. It is, but the way humanity sees it is as a form of destruction, and all of those dimensions added, and the howl, which is kind of an expression of energy. So how does one invoke and work through this energy is something which the glossary tries to do, and I think the 2 days of conversation has given us enough direction to kind of take further steps and the next steps in the questions that you all posed today on the glossary, that the questions that came up from the glossary. How does one deal with fragments? What are the structures and geometries of mutuality? How does one deal with moving systems of knowledge, and plenty of points to kind of go back to and pick up from. So thank you so much, everybody. Thank you, Solly and Mamta are there over here. So thank you again for being with us yesterday and today. And thank you again, Jivesh, Janvi, and Maria Laura. And thank you, everybody from C, Mobile and Vastu, of course. Have a wonderful evening, and we'll keep announcing more events and putting more ideas here. Thank you so much. Bye-bye.
Thank you, Prasad. Thank you.
Bye.
See you. Have a good sleep.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.
Thank you, Rupali and Prasad.
Bye.
Bye, everyone. Bye, Rupali.
Thank you. Thank you all. See you.